Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity finds its calm and science drifts like snowfall through the mind. Tonight we journey north, far beyond the edges of warmth, to a place where the world turns white and silence has a sound of its own. Beneath the quiet sky of the north lies a vast frozen ocean, a crown of ice so old and so deep that it has stored the breath of ancient worlds. Most people think of the Arctic as empty, a cold wasteland where nothing grows, where wind cuts across the horizon and the sea sleeps beneath a hard glass crust. But beneath that ice, there are secrets, old ones, buried in darkness for longer than humanity has walked the earth. The North hides not just cold and pressure and frozen water, but perhaps the remnants of ancient life itself, preserved in crystalline stillness, like a photograph the planet forgot to develop. Before we sink beneath that surface, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe you're somewhere warm, curled up under a blanket while rain taps against your window. Maybe you're already in a place where breath fogs the air. Whatever your setting, the idea that you and I can think about the Arctic together, across distance and time zones, feels fitting. Because the story of what lies under the North Pole is really a story about connection, between past and present, between heat and cold, between the living and what we thought was gone. And if this quiet exploration brings you even a little peace, or sparks a sense of wonder before sleep, it would mean a lot if you gave the video a like or perhaps subscribed. It helps this small space of calm and curiosity drift a little farther through the noise of the modern world, finding others who might also need to rest their minds on something vast and slow. The Arctic isn't just cold, it's a kind of mirror for time itself. When you stand on that frozen plain, the air feels ancient, as if it has passed through centuries unchanged. The ice is not still, though it appears that way. It moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, pushed by winds and currents, cracking and sealing, thickening and thinning in rhythms older than language. To look at it is to look at patience made visible. Yet under that stillness, beneath meters of ice and darkness, something may still stir, or rather, may simply endure. Cells that haven't divided for thousands of years, microorganisms that once thrived in a different climate, long before cities, before maps, before even the shape of our continents had settled into what we know. Scientists sometimes call the Arctic ice cap a time capsule, but that phrase feels almost too small. A capsule is something we make, something with intention. The ice of the North wasn't designed to hold history, it just did, because cold is the great preserver. In deep freeze, molecules slow, decay halts, and time loses its grip. Think of a fruit left on a kitchen counter. It ripens, softens, and disappears into rot within days. Now imagine that same fruit sealed in ice for 10,000 years. Inside, it's still there, colour-faded, cells collapsed, but recognisable. Multiply that by all the living things that have drifted, fallen, or frozen in the polar waters across eons, and you begin to sense how much could be waiting below. Not fossils, not bones, but traces of life itself. Proteins, genetic fragments, maybe even whole microorganisms suspended in cold stasis, waiting not to awaken, but to be seen. When researchers drill into Arctic ice, they are in effect drilling through time. Each layer captures a moment in Earth's story. The air that once filled the lungs of mammoths, the ash of ancient volcanoes, the chemical fingerprints of forgotten climates. But what makes the ice beneath the North Pole uniquely compelling is that it isn't just recording the atmosphere, it's recording ecosystems sealed away by pressure and darkness. Beneath the thickest parts of the ice sheet are pockets of trapped water, subglacial lakes and brine channels, where liquid persists even in the coldest conditions. These hidden habitats are shielded from sunlight, isolated for thousands, even millions of years. And yet, when samples are taken from similar environments in Antarctica, they show microbial life. Tiny, slow, but alive. It raises the question, If life can survive there in that endless cold, what might be sleeping beneath the North? To imagine that life could persist under such conditions is not wishful thinking. It's a reflection of how adaptable life has proven to be on Earth. We've found microbes living inside rocks, in boiling springs, in acidic pools, and in the crushing darkness of deep-sea vents. So why not under the polar ice? The ice itself contains nutrients, dust from deserts, particles from distant fires, salts carried by wind, and wherever nutrients and water exist, even in microscopic amounts, life finds a way to hold on. It doesn't thrive the way we think of thriving. It endures, often by slowing its processes to a crawl. Some bacteria can shut down almost completely, preserving their genetic material like tiny seeds, waiting for a change that may never come. In this way, the Arctic may be less a frozen void and more a vast, slow garden, one that grows across geological time instead of seasons. There's a quiet irony in that. For centuries, people imagined the poles as barren ends of the Earth, blank and hostile. Yet now we realise they might be among the most biologically rich archives of all. The layers of ice are stacked pages in a book of climate and life, and deep within those pages there may be paragraphs written by species long erased from the surface. To explore that record is to touch the edges of our own origins. If microbial life survived in the Arctic's subglacial pockets, it might resemble the earliest life forms on Earth, the kind that lived before oxygen filled the sky, when the planet was still young and volatile. Studying them could show us what life looked like when it was first finding its shape, when the line between chemistry and biology was still blurred. What makes the idea so haunting is not just the possibility of discovery, but the thought of time itself moving differently down there. The ice deep beneath the North Pole has been forming for hundreds of thousands of years, layer upon layer. Each season's snowfall compresses, traps air, locks away traces of the world above. The deeper you go, the further back you travel. At some point you cross into eras when no humans existed. The world then was warmer, then colder, then warmer again. Animals migrated, oceans rose and fell, continents shifted, and all the while snow fell in the north, compacting, sealing, preserving. To think that right now, a few kilometres under that ancient ice, there could be tiny organisms still intact, maybe still metabolizing faintly in the dark, is to realise how persistent life is, how unwilling it is to vanish completely. But this story isn't only about endurance, it's also about change. The Arctic is not the same place it was even 50 years ago. The ice that once stayed frozen year-round now breaks earlier, melts deeper, and drifts farther. What was once hidden might soon be exposed, and that creates both excitement and unease. When frozen landscapes thaw, they release more than meltwater. They release gases trapped for ages, carbon dioxide, methane, but also microbes. Some of those microbes are harmless, others are unknown. It's not science fiction to imagine ancient bacteria or viruses emerging from permafrost. It's already happened. In Siberia, researchers revived a virus from 30,000-year-old ice. It infected only amoebas, not people, but it proved a point. Under the right conditions, life that has been dormant for tens of millennia can stir again. So the question isn't just what lies beneath the North Pole, but what happens when it sees light again. The boundary between past and present blurs in melting ice. It's like opening a sealed letter from prehistory, only to find that its contents are still alive enough to write back. And there's a deeper question tucked inside all of this. If life can sleep for that long and still persist, what does that mean for our understanding of death? The Arctic, in that sense, is not just a place. It's a paradox. It's both a graveyard and a cradle, a place where endings and beginnings coexist in the same frozen breath. To walk on the ice is to stand above all that hidden potential without ever seeing it. You could look out across miles of white and feel as though you're standing at the edge of emptiness, but beneath your boots might be organisms that predate humanity, preserved so perfectly that their genetic code could still tell a story. The stillness above disguises movement below, slow circulations of water, currents of trapped brine, shifts of pressure that alter the landscape over centuries. Everything there moves differently, not in minutes or days, but in epochs. And in that difference lies a lesson about patience. The world doesn't always reveal its secrets in our lifetime scales. Sometimes it keeps them in the dark until it decides the time is right. Scientists are careful when they speak about life beneath the ice. They use words like potential, evidence, possibility. But between those cautious phrases is a kind of awe. When samples come up from deep cores, they're treated like treasures. Every flake is melted under sterile conditions, every droplet examined under microscopes, every bubble measured for its age. Within those droplets, sometimes there are traces, cells, dormant but intact, carbon chains that hint at metabolism, faint signatures of DNA. They're not proof of thriving ecosystems, but they're whispers. And those whispers are enough to make researchers wonder what else might be waiting. Because if we can find such resilience here, in the harshest cold on Earth, then life may be far more durable and widespread than we ever imagined. Beneath the quiet sky of the north, there are layers of memory stacked thicker than mountains, each one a record of a world that once was. Every breath you take has, in some sense, already passed through that frozen air. The Arctic is both a mirror and a vault, reflecting what we've been while storing what we've forgotten. To study it is to look backward through time while standing still, and maybe that's why it fascinates us so deeply. It reminds us that even in stillness there is movement. Even in silence there is life waiting to be heard. The wind over the pole doesn't care about discovery or theory. It just moves, sculpting drifts, whistling across pressure ridges, carving shapes that vanish as fast as they form. But somewhere below, unseen, are stories written in salt and ice. Stories that stretch across ages and continents. Stories of survival so quiet they make our own seem loud. And as we continue this journey deeper beneath that frozen surface, we'll begin to see how cold can be both a destroyer and a protector. How the very force that seems to stop life may also be the one that keeps it alive, waiting, unchanging, ready to tell us who we once were. The Arctic, when seen from above, looks like a white desert. From space it resembles a calm cloud that never moves, a soft swirl of frozen silence stretching over the top of the planet. But what looks simple from a distance hides a layered complexity that few places on Earth can match. The ice that covers the Northern Ocean is not uniform. It cracks, folds, and drifts in massive sheets. It opens into leads where dark water briefly shows itself, then seals again, as if shy of the light. Beneath those moving plates is another world entirely, a place so remote and cold that sunlight filters down only as a faint suggestion of day. It's here, under the surface, that a hidden realm quietly persists, cut off from most of the planet's change and yet profoundly connected to it. When explorers first ventured into the high Arctic, they imagined the ocean floor beneath the ice as empty, lifeless, a simple expanse of cold rock. What could possibly live in such perpetual night? Yet every time technology has improved, every time humans have managed to reach a little deeper, the answer has always been the same: more life than expected. Microbes form films along the underside of the ice, clinging to its surface where fresh meltwater meets salt. Tiny algae drift through the brine channels that thread the ice like veins, photosynthesizing faintly even in dim light. Below them, crustaceans, worms, and small fish move through the frigid water, following unseen currents, feeding on the minute traces of productivity that the ice allows. It's not a lush world, but it's a living one, and that alone changes how we think about isolation. Even here, cut off from warmth and light, the rules of survival find a way to play out. Beneath that layer of active sea life lies something older. Over millennia, the North has collected the dust of the world. Every eruption, every wildfire, every storm that carried particles into the atmosphere left traces that eventually drifted to the poles and settled. When snow fell, it sealed those traces away. As layer after layer compacted into ice, those particles sank deeper, forming thin bands of memory that can still be read today. In that sense, the Arctic is not just frozen water, it's the planet's most meticulous archivist. If you could read it like a book, you would find entire histories of climate, atmosphere, and even biological activity written between its layers. This archive is part of what scientists call cryospheric memory. The ice remembers in its own slow, crystalline language. Each bubble of trapped air contains a sample of ancient atmosphere. Each grain of dust tells of a desert or a fire somewhere far to the south. Embedded within those layers are microorganisms, pollen, fragments of cells, and in some cases whole bacteria locked away in glassy stillness. The ice beneath the North Pole may seem inert, but it's a vast frozen repository of the planet's biological and chemical past. And what it holds may be more than traces, it may be continuity. Because some of what is buried there isn't simply preserved, it may still, in its own suspended way, be alive. Life in ice is different from life anywhere else. In the warmth of soil or sea, energy flows quickly. Cells divide, consume, grow, and decay in endless turnover. In ice, everything slows to a crawl. Water molecules align into solid lattices, leaving only tiny pockets of liquid brine where salts prevent freezing. Within those pockets, if nutrients are available, cells can persist. They can remain metabolically active at astonishingly low rates, repairing themselves, maintaining their membranes, waiting for any hint of change. Some microbes from deep glacial samples have been revived after being frozen for hundreds of thousands of years. When given warmth and water, they begin to divide again, as if their long sleep had been only a moment's rest. This possibility reshapes how we see the ice beneath the North Pole. It's not merely a sheet covering an ocean. It's a dynamic system of ice, water, and ancient matter shifting constantly between solid and liquid, between silence and slow motion. Even within the ice there is movement. Crystals grow and compress. Salts migrate. Tiny droplets of liquid flow through channels too small for human eyes. Within those spaces, microbial life can migrate too, not quickly, but persistently, drifting with the molecular currents of frozen time. If that sounds improbable, consider that life has colonized every niche it has found on Earth. From boiling acid springs to radioactive waste pools to the dry valleys of Antarctica. Cold is no barrier, it's simply another condition to adapt to. What makes the Arctic so mysterious is that much of this happens unseen. The ice beneath the pole is difficult to study. The thickness can exceed several meters, and beneath that is water so cold and dark that even advanced submersibles must work carefully. Yet, every time samples are taken from below the ice, they tell a story that stretches back through ages. Some of the sediments on the ocean floor under the pole are more than 1 million years old. They hold fossils of tiny plankton that lived during warmer periods, when the Arctic was partly ice-free. These microfossils record changes in temperature, salinity, and nutrient flow, showing that the North has been both a frozen world and a thriving ocean many times over. The ice above acts as both shield and seal, preserving what lies below for future discovery. If you were to dive under the ice, past the last trace of daylight, the view would be startling. The ceiling above you would be uneven, a landscape of frozen hills and valleys, translucent blue in places where light filters down. Beneath it, the water moves with slow deliberation. Small organisms drift in suspension, some glowing faintly with bioluminescence, a rare spark in the dark. There's a hush to it all, a pressure that seems to fold sound into itself. This is the hidden world, beautiful, severe, and full of secrets. It's not the lifeless expanse explorers once imagined. It's an ecosystem shaped by scarcity, balanced perfectly between endurance and fragility. Deep below the ice, the seafloor rises into ridges and plateaus. The Lomonosov Ridge, for instance, cuts across the Arctic basin, dividing it into two main depths. Around its flanks, sediments accumulate slowly, millimetre by millimetre, building a record of what has lived and died above. In some areas, hydrothermal vents release minerals and heat, creating small oases in the cold. These vents may support microbial communities similar to those found in the deep oceans elsewhere. Bacteria that feed not on sunlight, but on chemistry, using energy from the Earth's crust. If such communities exist beneath the Arctic, they would be isolated from the rest of the biosphere, living in a world defined entirely by darkness and mineral breath. That makes them not just relics of life on Earth, but potential models for life beyond it. It's easy to forget how new our understanding of this region really is. Only in the last few decades have we begun to glimpse what the Arctic hides. Ice cores, satellite imaging, and sub-ice sampling have all revealed that what was once considered static is in fact alive with subtle motion. The ocean beneath the ice circulates slowly, exchanging water with the Atlantic and Pacific, carrying nutrients and sediments in long cycles. These currents may reach areas that have been sealed from sunlight for centuries, delivering traces of organic matter that sustain microbial networks we have yet to map. Each time researchers send instruments beneath the ice, they return with data that complicates what we thought we knew. The Arctic is not simple. It's a layered puzzle of interacting systems, each moving on its own clock. The stillness we associate with ice is misleading. On a molecular level, ice is restless. It forms, melts, refreezes, and flows. Crystals rearrange, pressure builds, and release follows. Even the so-called permanent ice beneath the North Pole is part of this endless cycle. Over time, it thickens and thins, migrates, fractures, and reforms. And as it does, it carries within it the history of everything it has touched. Dust from distant continents, microorganisms from warmer seas, gases from ancient atmospheres. Every inclusion is a clue, and taken together, they form an evolving picture of Earth's past. The Arctic, in that sense, is both a frozen frontier and an open archive, recording not just its own story, but the story of everything that drifts its way. What lies beneath that white surface isn't static matter. It's a dynamic equilibrium of water, ice, and life, moving through cycles that dwarf human time. There are brine channels where salt water remains liquid at sub-zero temperatures, microhabitats where light from the surface penetrates just enough to support photosynthesis, and layers of sediment that hold the biochemical fingerprints of organisms long vanished. These components interact subtly, forming a network of chemical and biological exchanges that has continued uninterrupted for ages. To study it is to step outside the usual rhythm of seasons and years and enter one measured in millennia. For those who study life in extreme environments, the Arctic is both a challenge and a revelation. It tests our understanding of what life requires and how far it can stretch those requirements. The frozen north demonstrates that life does not merely adapt to its environment, it reshapes it. Microbes within the ice alter its chemistry. They produce antifreeze proteins that modify how crystals form. They change the way light scatters, influencing albedo and ultimately the planet's climate balance. These minute organisms, invisible to the naked eye, contribute to global processes in ways we're only beginning to quantify. The world hidden under white is not just surviving, it's participating in the planet's broader system, quietly steering it from the shadows. When people imagine the Arctic melting, they often think of rising seas, polar bears, and distant glaciers collapsing into the ocean. But there's another layer to that story. As the ice thins, what was once hidden becomes accessible. Scientists can now explore areas that were unreachable for most of human history. This offers extraordinary opportunities for discovery, new species, ancient DNA, insights into planetary history. But it also brings ethical questions. Every drill, every probe, every expedition disturbs something that has been untouched for longer than civilization has existed. We approach this frozen world with instruments and curiosity, but also with responsibility. The ice is fragile not only in its structure but in its secrecy. Once disturbed, its ancient stillness cannot be replaced. The world beneath the white surface of the North is not only a scientific frontier but a philosophical one. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about time, resilience, and the boundaries of life. It shows us that endings are not always endings, that what we call frozen can still be active, and what we call dead can sometimes wait patiently for the right conditions to stir again. Beneath the Arctic, there is a continuum of existence so slow that it defies our perception, a persistence that suggests life's ultimate talent is not speed or dominance but endurance. As we continue to explore what lies under the ice, we are also exploring the limits of our imagination. The Arctic challenges our sense of what a world can be. It's not barren, not empty, not simple. It's a layered, breathing system moving on scales that are hard for us to comprehend. And as we peer deeper into its hidden chambers, we begin to realize that the story of this place is not separate from ours. The gases trapped in those layers influence our climate. The microorganisms that dwell there shape the chemistry of the oceans. The melting of those ancient sheets is changing coastlines thousands of kilometers away. The Arctic may be remote, but it is not distant. It's connected to everything we touch, breathe, and build. To stand before that vast white horizon is to look at both the beginning and the end of things. The ice conceals and reveals, preserves and transforms. Beneath it there's a world still writing its story, one molecule at a time. And as the journey continues, we move closer to understanding how that hidden world came to be, and what it can teach us about the nature of life itself, life that freezes, waits, and endures, even under the endless white. The deeper you go into the cold, the more it begins to reveal its quiet paradox. Most of what we understand about life is rooted in warmth. Heat drives motion, fuels reactions, and keeps systems dynamic. Yet here, under the vast weight of polar ice, cold does the opposite of what we expect. It slows, stills, and in doing so, protects. In most of the world, cold means death or dormancy, but in the Arctic, it means preservation. The same freezing that would kill a human in minutes becomes a shield for everything small enough to wait out the ages. The cold that should destroy life instead locks it into survival, not by keeping it active, but by holding it in suspension, a pause button pressed for millennia. To understand how this happens, it helps to think of what cold actually does. When temperatures drop, molecules lose energy. They move less, collide less, and reactions slow. In biology, that means the machinery of life, the enzymes, membranes, and chemical exchanges that make up metabolism, grinds down. If it stops entirely, cells rupture as ice crystals form inside them. But if it slows just enough, if there is a balance between freezing and flow, life can endure. Some microbes have evolved extraordinary strategies to achieve this. They produce special proteins and sugars that protect their cells from ice damage, preventing crystals from puncturing their membranes. Others excrete antifreeze compounds that lower the freezing point of their internal fluids. A few can even replace water inside their cells with more stable molecules that resist freezing altogether. These adaptations turn what would be a lethal environment into a kind of stasis chamber, one that can last indefinitely as long as the cold remains. In the Arctic, such mechanisms aren't rare, they're routine. Every winter, as temperatures plunge, microscopic life in sea ice goes dormant, wrapped in a film of brine that remains liquid even when the surrounding water freezes solid. When summer returns and meltwater trickles through the ice, these cells wake again, resuming photosynthesis, respiration, and reproduction as if nothing had happened. They have done this cycle for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, adapting not through speed, but through patience. It's this patience that allows them to survive even deeper, where no seasons reach, where the ice is not temporary but permanent. There, the same chemistry that preserves an organism for a winter can preserve it for an epoch. Scientists studying ancient ice cores have found living bacteria in samples over 500,000 years old. The cells are few and sluggish, but when warmed gently in nutrient-rich water, some begin to grow again. It's as if they've been waiting all that time, perfectly suspended between existence and non-existence. The conditions that made that possible are not mystical. They're physical: stable temperature, lack of oxygen, and isolation from the surface. In the absence of heat, decomposition halts. In the absence of oxygen, oxidation, the slow rusting of organic material, stops. And under the pressure of ice, the structure of molecules remains intact. Together, those factors create the most efficient preservation system nature has ever designed. You can see the results of this preservation not only in microbes, but in larger relics that the Arctic occasionally releases. The thawing permafrost of Siberia and northern Canada has yielded mammoth carcasses with skin, hair, and even blood cells intact. Mosses have been revived from ice layers tens of thousands of years old. Seeds buried for centuries in frozen soil have sprouted again in laboratory conditions. Each of these examples tells the same story. Cold does not erase life, it postpones it. In the right circumstances, it turns living material into a message that can be read long after the sender has vanished. This property of cold makes the Arctic one of the few places on Earth where the boundary between life and death becomes unclear. When scientists unearth a bacterium or plant that has been dormant for millennia, they're not resurrecting the dead. They're continuing a life that never truly ended. It's simply slowed to a speed too small for our usual senses to register. There's something deeply humbling about that. We tend to think of time as relentless, moving forward without pause, but in the cold, time bends. Processes that take seconds at room temperature may take centuries in the deep freeze. Decay, which dominates the warm parts of the world, loses its power. The cold preserves not only matter, but memory. That memory isn't metaphorical. The molecules preserved in ice tell stories. DNA, the long chain of instructions that encodes life, degrades quickly in heat but can persist in cold for astonishing lengths of time. From ancient permafrost, researchers have extracted genetic material belonging to extinct species, mapping out their relationships and habitats. From ice cores, they've reconstructed past ecosystems, tracing how plankton and bacteria responded to changes in temperature and light. Even the isotopes of water trapped in glacial layers reveal fluctuations in global climate, showing how the planet has cycled through warmth and cold long before industrial history began. In this way, the Arctic acts as a recorder, not through sound or sight, but through chemistry. Every molecule is a note in its vast frozen composition. It's strange to think that something so desolate can be so full of information. But perhaps it's precisely because of that desolation that the record survives. In warmth, everything interacts, reacts, and breaks down. In cold, things rest. The molecules of an ancient microbe under the ice might still vibrate faintly, their bonds held tight by temperature. If they are ever released, they can tell us not just that life existed, but what form it took, what it ate, how it built itself, and how it adapted to its environment. And because many of those microbes lived in conditions similar to those that might exist on other planets or moons, they provide a blueprint for how life could persist elsewhere in the universe. Every frozen bacterium under the North Pole is, in a way, a small planetary experiment that has been running quietly for ages. The power of cold to preserve is also what makes it dangerous when disturbed. When ice melts, everything it held returns to circulation, not just gases, but biological material. Ancient carbon locked in permafrost is released as methane or carbon dioxide, accelerating global warming. Microbes re-enter ecosystems that have evolved without them for millennia. Most are harmless, but some might not be. It's impossible to predict how modern environments will respond to ancient biology. The Arctic's role as a vault is only as secure as its temperature, and that temperature is changing fast. Each degree of warming is an unlocking, a slow exhalation of the planet's oldest breath. Still, the cold's capacity to preserve has made it an ally for human understanding. Museums, laboratories and seed banks all borrow from its principle. We freeze what we want to keep safe. We store DNA, tissues and cells in liquid nitrogen to halt their decay. We freeze food, documents, even ideas in digital form stored in Arctic vaults built into mountains. All of this reflects a deep, almost instinctive trust in what cold can do. It's a reminder that preservation doesn't always require intervention. Sometimes it only requires stillness. When scientists dig into Arctic ice, they must work carefully to maintain that stillness as long as possible. Samples must remain frozen from the moment they are extracted to the moment they are examined. Any warming can change their chemistry, allow modern contaminants to mix with ancient material, or destroy the structures that held stable for centuries. It's delicate work, but the reward is unparalleled. In those clear cylinders of ice are frozen records of volcanoes, solar cycles, atmospheric composition, and traces of organisms long extinct. Each sample is a condensed story of Earth's changing face, and each layer is so precisely arranged that by analysing its depth, researchers can tell not just what happened, but when. The idea that cold can protect life is not unique to Earth. When scientists consider where else in the solar system life might exist, they look to frozen worlds, moons like Europa, Enceladus, and Ganymede, where thick ice covers global oceans. The logic is the same. If water exists in liquid form beneath that ice, and if it has persisted for long periods, then life might exist there too. The cold that isolates those oceans from radiation and storms also shields any potential organisms within. In this way, the Arctic doesn't just preserve Earth's history, it serves as an analogue for extraterrestrial environments, a kind of laboratory where we can study how life behaves when heat and light are scarce. Under the microscope, a sample of Arctic ice looks almost alive. Tiny channels run through it, filled with saline water. Within them, bacteria and algae cluster together, forming small communities that exchange nutrients, reproduce slowly, and respond to subtle changes in temperature and light. When researchers warm these samples slightly, the organisms stir, some moving for the first time in years. Their survival isn't accidental. Over time, evolution has selected for those that can tolerate freezing, that can use trace elements and minimal energy to maintain themselves. The cold doesn't extinguish their spark, it keeps it safe, tucked within a crystalline shield that endures storms, seasons and centuries. Even materials that aren't alive in the usual sense are affected by this preservation. Organic molecules, including amino acids and lipids, remain stable in the cold far longer than they would elsewhere. These molecules are the raw ingredients of life, and their persistence means that if they ever existed in the Arctic Ocean's depths, they could still be there, frozen in sediments or trapped in ancient ice layers. For astrobiologists, that possibility is tantalizing. It suggests that life, once begun, is difficult to erase completely. It may go dormant, it may hide, but it leaves traces that outlast even continents. The story of the Arctic's preservation is, at its core, a story about limits. The limits of decay, the limits of endurance, and the limits of our own perception. It forces us to see cold not as emptiness, but as a state of conservation. When explorers describe the eerie perfection of a frozen landscape, they're witnessing what happens when time slows to almost nothing. The snow doesn't rot, the bones don't crumble, even colour lingers, muted but present. It's an environment where entropy loses momentum, where the natural drive toward disorder is temporarily suspended. That suspension creates beauty, but it also holds knowledge. It keeps the record of what once was intact long enough for us to find it. To think of cold this way changes how we view fragility. In our daily lives, we associate survival with movement, adaptation, and energy. The Arctic teaches a different lesson, that sometimes endurance means stopping. The organisms locked in ice survive precisely because they expend almost no energy. They have learned that to last one must slow down. that principle extends beyond biology. Civilizations preserve their histories by freezing them in symbols, language, and art. Memory itself is a kind of preservation through stillness. We hold on to what matters by keeping it from changing too fast. The Arctic, in its vast silence, is a living example of that principle written across an entire landscape. As we move deeper into this frozen world, the idea of preservation becomes more than scientific curiosity. It becomes a mirror for how life interacts with time. The ice beneath the North Pole doesn't simply store old things, it demonstrates how the planet remembers. Every flake that settles adds to that memory, sealing away not just evidence of temperature and chemistry, but evidence of life's persistence. The cold doesn't erase, it archives. And that archive, layered and patient, may yet reveal forms of life we've never seen. Life that doesn't fear stillness, that doesn't fight the cold, but uses it as shelter. Somewhere below the frozen crust, beyond the reach of light, there may be cells that have waited longer than all of recorded history. They're not fossils. They're fragments of continuity, part of the same living thread that connects all biology on Earth. When the time comes, when ice gives way or human hands uncover them, they'll offer a glimpse not of what was lost, but of what was preserved. In their quiet endurance lies the proof that cold, far from being an end, can be a form of protection, a promise written in ice that life, once begun, never truly disappears. It simply waits. The ice that crowns the top of the planet is more than frozen water. It's a reservoir of history, a vast library written in transparent pages that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. Beneath every metre of Arctic ice, there are tiny bubbles of air, each one a small, perfect container of an atmosphere that no longer exists. To look at that ice under a microscope is to see time trapped in its purest form. Each bubble is a breath from a vanished world, sealed so tightly that even after entire civilizations have risen and fallen, it still holds the same mix of gases that once drifted through prehistoric skies. When scientists melt that ice in a lab and release those bubbles, they are, in a literal sense, inhaling the breath of the planet's past. The water itself is just as old. Some of the molecules locked in polar ice have been circulating through Earth's systems since before mammals appeared. A single drop could have fallen as rain onto an ancient forest, flowed through rivers that no longer exist, evaporated into clouds, and finally descended as snow at the top of the world, where it froze and stayed. It's easy to forget that water is one of the most stable substances on Earth. It changes form constantly, liquid to vapour to solid and back again, but the molecules themselves rarely break apart. The same atoms that formed the oceans of early Earth are the ones you drink today. When we speak of ancient water, we're not speaking metaphorically. The Arctic ice holds literal remnants of the primordial sea, locked away in cold and darkness, older than our species, older than much of the life that now walks the surface. Each layer of ice is a chapter of climate and chemistry. Snow falls, compresses, and traps the air of its own time. The deeper you drill, the further back you go. Hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands of years. The air bubbles at the bottom of an ice core might contain the atmosphere from an age when giant mammals roamed across tundras, when forests grew where deserts now lie. Those bubbles reveal how much carbon dioxide and methane were in the air, how warm or cold the world was, and how quickly climates shifted. They are precise, silent witnesses to everything that has happened since. It's one thing to imagine that the air you breathe connects you to every other living thing, but it's another to realise that parts of that air have been sleeping under ice since before humans had words. The Arctic doesn't just preserve the bodies of creatures or the traces of microbes, it preserves breath itself. The story of how that air gets trapped begins with snow. When it falls, it carries tiny particles, dust, pollen, salt, and even fragments of microorganisms drifting in the wind. As layer upon layer builds up, the weight compresses the lower layers, squeezing the snow into firn and then into solid ice. The spaces between crystals close off, sealing the air inside. The The deeper the layer, the more ancient the air. In some cores, the gases are so old that they record not just natural cycles, but entire shifts in planetary behaviour. They show, for example, that the Earth has swung repeatedly between ice ages and warm periods, that carbon levels have risen and fallen like a slow heartbeat long before humans began adding their own influence. Within those measurements lies a quiet reassurance and a quiet warning. The reassurance is that the planet has always changed. The warning is that it has never changed this quickly before. The water in the ice carries information of its own. The ratio of heavy to light isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen in each layer tells scientists about temperature, humidity, and even the origin of the moisture that formed it. In this way, a single ice core can map the journey of water molecules across continents and oceans. Some came from the Pacific, some from the Atlantic, some from the evaporation of tropical storms thousands of kilometers away. The Arctic is the final resting place of all these journeys, the point where water's endless cycle pauses to record itself before moving on again. When the ice melts naturally, the molecules rejoin the ocean and begin their circuit anew, but for a while, sometimes a very long while, they belong to the stillness. The phrase ancient water sounds almost mystical, but what makes it remarkable is its ordinariness. Water doesn't have memory in the human sense, yet in its persistence it holds the continuity of everything. Every living thing that has ever existed has depended on the same planetary reservoir, reshuffled endlessly, but never lost. In the Arctic, that truth becomes tangible. You can take a vial of melted polar ice and know that what you hold once existed in clouds that drifted over prehistoric landscapes, that it might have quenched the thirst of animals now long extinct, or frozen into crystals during glacial advances that shape the face of continents. Each molecule has a lineage, each is a thread in the planet's unbroken chain of renewal. The breath trapped inside the ice adds another dimension to that lineage. When scientists analyse those bubbles, they find not just common gases, but faint traces of biological activity, tiny amounts of methane produced by ancient microbes, or oxygen levels that hint at global forests breathing in unison. These details allow researchers to reconstruct not just temperature but life itself. For instance, variations in carbon isotopes can reveal how much photosynthesis was happening at a given time. A spike in oxygen might indicate the flourishing of plant life across continents, while a drop could suggest widespread fires or extinctions. The Arctic, in this sense, is not just a record of weather, it's a record of metabolism, the slow inhale and exhale of the living Earth. It's easy to romanticize this, to imagine the North as a sleeping cathedral of frozen breath. But the reality is even more impressive because it's physical, measurable and real. The air in those bubbles is still chemically active. When released, it can be studied just like modern air. Scientists use it to calibrate models of climate change, to test theories about how quickly the planet responds to disturbances. They can measure how much carbon dioxide was in the air before humans burned fossil fuels and compare it to today. The difference is startling. The bubbles whisper of balance, a balance that lasted for hundreds of millennia before industrial times disrupted it. Those small pockets of ancient air are reminders not only of where we came from, but of how fragile our current equilibrium is. The idea that the Arctic holds the planet's breath is more than poetic, it's biological. The cycles of gases trapped there mirror the cycles of respiration in living things. Oxygen rises, carbon dioxide falls, then the pattern reverses just as lungs inhale and exhale. When we breathe, we participate in that same exchange, linking our own temporary lives to the long rhythm of the Earth. In a way, the air you draw into your lungs tonight might contain atoms that once drifted through those ancient bubbles, released when the ice melted, mixed into the modern atmosphere, and found their way to you. You are, in the most literal sense, breathing history. The planet's memory moves through you with every breath. Beneath the North Pole, where the ice meets the seawater below, that cycle continues on a microscopic scale. Tiny organisms living on the underside of the ice release and consume gases as they photosynthesize or respire. The exchange between these living communities and the frozen layers above them creates a delicate chemical balance that affects the entire Arctic Ocean. When sunlight reaches through cracks or thin ice during summer, bursts of activity occur, algae bloom, microbes feed, oxygen levels fluctuate. When winter returns and the light fades, the activity slows, but traces of it remain sealed within the forming ice, preserved for future study. Over centuries, these patterns build a layered record not only of the physical environment, but of the living processes within it. This interplay between frozen and living breath makes the Arctic unique. It's one of the few places where you can trace an unbroken connection between the biosphere and the geosphere, between life and landscape. The gases that escape from melting ice today may have been exhaled by ancient forests or microbes before any human existed. That continuity blurs the distinction between the living and the inanimate. The atmosphere itself becomes part of the planet's body, and the ice its lungs, slowly expanding and contracting through time. There's also a more unsettling side to this connection. As the Arctic warms, the air trapped in ancient ice and permafrost is being released faster than ever before. Methane and carbon dioxide, sealed away since long before humanity, are returning to the atmosphere, adding to the greenhouse effect that melts the ice even further. It's a feedback loop, an ancient breath awakening, accelerating its own release. Scientists refer to this as the permafrost carbon feedback, but stripped of terminology, it's simply the planet exhaling its oldest memory. The same process that once recorded our world's history now threatens to rewrite its future. Still, in that slow, dangerous release, there is knowledge. Each new measurement, each captured bubble, teaches us something about how Earth behaves. It tells us that climate and life have always been intertwined, that every species, including ours, is part of that larger respiration. It tells us that change is constant, but also that equilibrium is delicate. The Arctic is not a static relic of the past. It's an active participant in the planet's breathing, a regulator, a witness, and perhaps now a warning. When researchers return from polar expeditions, they often speak of the strange intimacy they feel with the ice. They describe the sound of drilling, a soft, consistent crackle as ancient air escapes, and the moment when the first bubble bursts under warm laboratory lights. That sound, almost imperceptible, is the sound of the past joining the present. It's not dramatic, but it carries weight. It's the release of something that has waited quietly, carrying messages across epochs. Some of those messages are simple, the composition of gases, the ratio of isotopes. Others are more profound, the reminder that our planet remembers everything, even the air we've forgotten. In that sense, the Arctic is less a place and more a process, a slow conversation between ice, water, and atmosphere that has continued for millions of years. Each snowflake that falls onto the pole is a participant in that dialogue. It carries a trace of the world it left behind, joins others in a frozen archive, and eventually becomes part of a record so deep it touches geological time. When we study those layers, we're eavesdropping on a story that began long before we arrived. It's a story written not in words, but in ratios, pressures, and frozen breaths. To think about ancient water is to think about continuity without interruption. Water doesn't vanish, it circulates. The drop frozen at the pole today might return as rain in 1,000 years. It might flow through rivers, feed plants, and enter another living body before eventually returning north again. Each molecule completes the same long circuit. The ice beneath the North Pole is a checkpoint in that circuit, a pause in motion that allows us to see the system at rest. When you consider that, it becomes difficult to see the Arctic as remote. It's part of the same cycle that moves through every living thing. Its ancient water is also ours, its ancient breath mingling with our own. There's a certain humility that comes from realizing this. The air we exhale tonight will disperse, travel the globe, and perhaps centuries from now settle again as snow somewhere far to the north. It may become part of the next layer of ice, trapping a faint trace of our time for whoever studies it in the future. We too will leave our mark in the frozen record, our atmosphere, our temperature, our chemistry, all written into the next generation of Arctic layers. In that way, the ice does not just preserve the past, it quietly absorbs the present. It makes no distinction between ancient and modern, between natural and human. It simply records. So when we speak of ancient water and ancient breath, we're not describing relics of a distant world. We're describing the ongoing memory of this one. The ice beneath the North Pole is both archive and participant, storing the planet's oldest whispers while continuing to shape the air we breathe and the oceans we depend on. It is the closest thing we have to a planetary diary, written in frozen water, sealed in pressure, and read through light. And as long as it remains, it will continue to tell the story of a world that has been breathing for billions of years, one long, continuous exhale that includes us and everything that came before. When people think of life, they think of movement. They picture things growing, dividing, breathing, searching, eating, reproducing. Life, in the way we usually understand it, means activity. But beneath the North Pole, the definition stretches. In the deepest layers of ice and permafrost, life takes on a form that is neither alive nor dead in the way we recognise. It's suspended, patient, and unchanged. It's life that has chosen waiting as its strategy, survival not through speed or aggression, but through the absolute minimum of motion. Down there, existence continues in slow motion, where seconds stretch into centuries and cells linger in states that border on stillness. The organisms caught in that world of ice are not gone, they're simply resting, maintaining the faint pulse of chemistry that separates them from nothingness. They are proof that life, once it begins, doesn't easily let go. It learns to adapt not just to light and warmth, but to the absence of both. At first glance, this seems impossible. The Arctic's deep ice is not just cold, it's utterly hostile to everything we associate with living systems. There's no sunlight to drive photosynthesis, no liquid water in the usual sense, no steady supply of nutrients. Temperatures can fall below -50 degrees Celsius. Under those conditions, water molecules freeze into rigid lattices, ice crystals grow sharp enough to tear through cell membranes, and chemical reactions slow to almost nothing. And yet, when samples from those depths are brought to the surface and studied carefully, they often contain cells that are not only intact, but still capable of activity when warmed. They begin to metabolize, to repair, sometimes even to divide. These organisms are not fossils. They're time travelers, bridging ages by slowing themselves almost to a stop. The mechanism that allows this is both simple and astonishing. Many microorganisms, when faced with extreme cold or dryness, enter a state called dormancy. They shut down most of their biological functions, reducing metabolism to the barest trace. Some form protective shells or spores, hard coatings that prevent damage from radiation or ice crystals. Others produce cryoprotectants, molecules that prevent freezing inside the cell by binding water or lowering its freezing point. In this state, life can persist without food, without light, and without change for astonishing periods of time. It's a strategy that predates animals, plants, even complex cells. It's one of life's oldest survival tools, and nowhere on Earth does it find a more perfect refuge than beneath the Arctic ice. When a microbe goes dormant in that environment, it becomes part of a frozen archive that holds more than the chemical record of the past. It holds potential. Within those cells is genetic material that may have been absent from the biosphere for millions of years. Each one is a tiny vessel carrying evolutionary information, preserved not as fossils or impressions but as functioning biology. Scientists studying these organisms have revived bacteria from ice over 500,000 years old, and from permafrost twice that age. In laboratory conditions, these cells awaken as though nothing extraordinary has happened. They resume their simple existence as if they had merely paused for a moment. For them, time has no meaning. They have outlasted species, climates, and even ice ages, waiting patiently for the return of conditions they can use. It's worth remembering that dormancy is not sleep in the way we know it. There's no awareness, no consciousness, no sense of duration. A dormant microbe doesn't know it's waiting. It simply is. Its DNA remains stable, its proteins folded, its membranes sealed. In the cold, decay halts. The usual forces that break down biological material are frozen along with everything else. That stasis creates a kind of immortality, not in a grand or mystical sense, but in the precise chemical reality that matter doesn't change when the processes of change are stopped. A living cell in a glacier a kilometre deep is not decaying, not growing, not dying. It exists in perfect suspension, paused in an equilibrium so complete that time ceases to matter. From a human perspective, this kind of endurance is difficult to comprehend. We measure our lives in years, perhaps decades. Even trees, which can live for centuries, experience the world in cycles of growth and rest. But the organisms trapped beneath the Arctic ice operate on a scale that stretches beyond any individual lifespan. Their persistence is geological, not biological. They belong as much to the structure of the planet as to the tree of life. They survive not by competing, not by evolving quickly, but by holding still until the world changes enough for them to move again. That ability to wait is what connects them to the broader story of survival on Earth. In every environment, there are moments when conditions become impossible. Volcanoes erupt, seas dry up, ice covers continents. Yet again and again, life finds a way through those intervals. Sometimes it does so by adaptation, developing new mechanisms to cope with the challenge. But sometimes, as in the Arctic, it simply endures unchanged. Dormant cells in permafrost have survived repeated cycles of freezing and thawing, glaciations and the shifts of entire ecosystems above them. They've seen the planet warm and cool many times without ever participating in those changes directly. They are, in a sense, the planet's contingency plan, the part of life that waits quietly in reserve while the rest of the world transforms. When scientists first began to find living cells in deep ice cores, the discovery challenged assumptions about the limits of habitability. It suggested that as long as there is some water, some protection from radiation, and temperatures not cold enough to destroy molecular structures, life can persist indefinitely. This has profound implications, not just for understanding Earth, but for exploring other worlds. If microbes can remain viable in the ice beneath the North Pole for hundreds of thousands of years, then perhaps similar organisms could exist in the frozen crust of Mars, or beneath the icy shells of Europa or Enceladus. The Arctic becomes a natural analogue for extraterrestrial environments, showing how life can bridge immense spans of time without evolving, simply by enduring. What's remarkable about this form of persistence is its subtlety. Dormant life doesn't consume energy, doesn't alter its surroundings, doesn't leave obvious traces. It hides within the fabric of the environment itself, indistinguishable from the non-living until it wakes. That makes it both fascinating and difficult to study. Detecting life in such a state requires looking for the faintest signs, molecules that suggest metabolism, changes in chemical balance, or the presence of intact genetic material. In many cases, researchers have to distinguish between truly living organisms and those whose remains are merely well preserved. Yet even the line between the two blurs. If a cell structure remains intact for 500,000 years, containing DNA that could, under the right conditions, be read or replicated, is it entirely correct to call it dead? The Arctic's deep cold has been the backdrop for this question for decades. Permafrost samples from Siberia have yielded viable bacteria dating back to the Pleistocene. Some of these species have no modern relatives, others are distantly related to those still living in cold soils today. The DNA sequences extracted from them tell stories of adaptation and migration, of ancient lineages that survived global changes by retreating underground. Each cell is a clue to how ecosystems reorganize themselves through time, how life responded to the shifting balance of heat and ice. More than that, they are proof that extinction is not always as complete as it seems. When an environment disappears, part of its biology can linger invisibly, waiting for its world to return. There are examples closer to the present that show how powerful this ability is. In the Arctic seasonal ice, microorganisms go through cycles of dormancy and revival every year. As the surface freezes in winter, they slow almost to stillness. When spring sunlight returns and meltwater trickles through the ice, they awaken, absorbing light and nutrients, dividing again, feeding small food webs that ripple through the polar ocean. This rhythm has continued uninterrupted for millennia, a living demonstration of endurance and renewal. It's the same pattern scaled down from geological time to biological rhythm. Life pauses, then resumes, endlessly repeating. Dormant life also plays a role in the stability of ecosystems beyond the ice. Soils, sediments, and even the upper layers of the ocean contain vast seed banks of microbial cells that remain inactive until conditions favour them. In this way, life maintains its own continuity. It preserves diversity not by preserving individuals, but by storing potential. The Arctic's frozen reservoirs are an extreme form of this principle, a planetary-scale seed bank holding forms of life that span ages. When the ice melts, some of those forms may re-enter circulation, perhaps even influencing modern microbial communities in subtle ways. It's an ongoing exchange between past and present, mediated by temperature and time. For those who study it, this suspended life challenges more than biological definitions. It raises philosophical questions about what it means to exist. If a microbe can remain inert for hundreds of thousands of years, is its life continuous? Or does each awakening represent a new beginning? If its genetic material remains unchanged while everything else evolves, is it a relic or a participant? These questions are not abstract. They shape how scientists search for life elsewhere, and how we understand our own planet's resilience. The Arctic, in its quiet way, provides a living demonstration that life's essential quality is persistence, not activity. It shows that survival doesn't always require motion, only the capacity to endure until motion becomes possible again. The implications extend beyond biology. In the study of disease, cryopreservation uses similar principles to store cells, tissues, and even whole embryos for decades without decay. The Cold-Holtz chemical reactions preserve structures and holds potential in abeyance until reanimation. The same logic that allows us to freeze a cell in a laboratory is at work in the permafrost, operating on a scale that spans continents. The difference is that nature doesn't design it with purpose. It happens because the conditions align. In this way, the Arctic functions as both a cryogenic vault and an experimental field, showing us what happens when preservation and time interact without interference. There's something deeply grounding about the thought that, right now, beneath kilometers of ice, there are cells quietly existing in that paused state. They don't know about the seasons, about civilizations, about warming trends or exploration. They exist entirely outside the awareness that defines our experience of life, and yet they're connected to us. Their persistence shaped the chemistry of our world long before we arrived. The oxygen we breathe, the carbon in our bodies, the nutrients in the oceans, all of it has passed through cycles that these ancient lineages helped sustain. In their endurance lies part of the foundation for everything that came after. The possibility that life might never truly die, only transform, has long fascinated scientists and philosophers alike. The Arctic gives that idea physical form. It demonstrates that life's boundary is more flexible than we thought. Death, in many cases, is simply a matter of conditions. Change the temperature, the pressure, or the availability of water, and what seemed gone can resume. It's a reminder that endings are often temporary, that disappearance is sometimes just another form of waiting. The frozen cells beneath the North Pole carry that truth in their silence. They are neither gone nor fully here, neither past nor present. They occupy a state in between, proving that the essence of life is not its speed, but its persistence. When the ice eventually melts, and it will, in some places faster than others, some of that sleeping life will awaken. Most of it will integrate harmlessly into modern ecosystems, continuing the slow cycle of exchange that has always existed between ice and sea. Some might not survive the transition. The world they knew is gone, but even in their decay they will release nutrients, molecules and genes that become part of new systems. Nothing is wasted. The Arctic's frozen life will rejoin the global cycle, its ancient chemistry blending with ours, its genetic echoes perhaps influencing the future in ways we can't yet see. To look at the Arctic this way is to see it not as a frozen wasteland but as a cradle of continuity. It's a place where life shows its quietest strength, the ability to pause, to preserve itself, to persist beyond change. The microbes under the ice are the planet's long-term memory, carrying fragments of what the world once was, and reminders of what it still can be. They teach us that survival doesn't always mean triumph or motion. Sometimes it means stillness. Sometimes it means waiting so long that time itself becomes irrelevant. And in that waiting, in that slow persistence, life demonstrates its most remarkable quality. It doesn't easily surrender. It finds a way to endure, even when every condition seems against it. When scientists drill deep into Arctic ice, the sound is oddly calm. There's a rhythmic vibration, a hollow hiss of compressed air, and then the slow grind of the drill biting through ancient layers. Every rotation brings up fragments of frozen history, each one whispering of a time when the world was different. The cores that emerge are cylinders of perfect clarity, often stretching several meters long, smooth as glass and cold enough to burn skin. To hold one is to hold time itself. What comes out of those boreholes are not just samples for study, they are messages from the deep freeze, fragments of a story written molecule by molecule over hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer, each trapped bubble of air, is a note in a message the planet has been writing in silence since before we appeared to read it. When those cores reach laboratories, they are treated like fragile relics. They must stay frozen until the moment of study. Inside them are trapped not only air and dust, but traces of living matter, cells, organic molecules, remnants of life that once floated through the atmosphere or swam in seas long gone. The deep freeze doesn't just capture physical conditions, it captures presence. Every ice layer is a snapshot of an ecosystem frozen in place. And though the information within looks simple, measurements of gas concentrations, isotope ratios, or dust composition, it translates into a narrative as detailed as any written record. Scientists can trace volcanic eruptions from the tiny ash particles they find. They can identify meteor impacts, droughts, even global pandemics that left chemical traces in the air. It's astonishing how much the frozen world remembers. The first message the ice gives is about stability. When cores from Greenland and Antarctica were first compared, they told an identical story, that Earth's temperature and atmosphere move together, rising and falling in rhythm. The deeper the layer, the older the message, and the same pattern holds. The planet breathes in carbon, warms, exhales it, cools. This rhythm stretches back 800,000 years, visible as waves in data, but invisible to the eye unless you know how to read the ice. The frozen air bubbles mark every turn of that planetary breath. For most of that time, the oscillations were gentle. Only recently did the pattern break, the line of carbon rising sharply, unnaturally, within the blink of a geological eye. That spike is our signature, our own message written into the archive, distinct from all that came before. But the ice holds other kinds of messages, ones less obvious and far more personal. Buried deep within the frozen layers are biological traces that speak to life's persistence. Tiny microbes, long dormant, cling to the interior of air bubbles, or exist in thin veins of brine that wind through the ice like invisible rivers. When researchers melt these samples carefully, those cells sometimes stir. They metabolize faintly, react to their surroundings, or even divide. To witness that is to see something close to resurrection, though it isn't mystical. It's chemistry following its rules after a long pause. These microorganisms send their own message, that life's boundaries are broader than we thought, that even in near absolute stillness, existence can continue. Not all messages from the deep freeze are so quiet. Some are warnings. Layers rich in soot and black carbon mark centuries when forests burned uncontrollably, sometimes from natural fires, sometimes from human activity. Other layers contain heavy metals, radioactive isotopes, and industrial chemicals that have drifted to the poles through the atmosphere. The Arctic, for all its remoteness, is where the world's pollution gathers. The cold traps it, preserving it as evidence of what we've done. Those signals are clear, measurable, and irreversible. They tell us that nothing we release into the air truly disappears. It circulates, settles, and in time becomes part of the frozen record, waiting for future generations to discover it. The ice also preserves traces of pandemics. In Greenland's glaciers, researchers have identified layers corresponding to the 14th century that show sharp drops in greenhouse gases. The reason, they believe, is that human populations declined drastically during the Black Death, allowing forests to regrow and absorb carbon. Even the planet's sicknesses leave chemical fingerprints in ice. More recent layers bear traces of nuclear tests, microplastics, and industrial emissions, forming a new kind of geological epoch, the Anthropocene, defined by human influence. In this way, the ice reads like an evolving letter, written by nature and annotated by us, filled with both discovery and confession. When scientists cut through those layers, they use instruments that can detect changes so small they border on the invisible. A slight shift in isotopes might indicate a sudden cooling event triggered by volcanic ash blocking sunlight. A tiny increase in trapped methane might mean the release of gas from thawing permafrost thousands of years ago. These subtle differences, recorded over millennia, reveal how sensitive the planet is to change. They show that climate can swing from stability to crisis with surprising speed, often within decades, and that understanding gives new weight to our present moment. The ice doesn't speak in metaphors. Its messages are precise, mathematical, undeniable. They say that change is natural, but imbalance is dangerous. They say that time can be patient, but not endlessly forgiving. Beyond data and measurement, though, there's something human in how we read these messages. The act of drilling, of listening to the sound of the core breaking free, of watching ancient air fizz from melted ice, connects us directly to the past in a way that few experiences can. It's not just information, it's contact. The same atmosphere that once brushed across the skin of mammoths or drifted through forests of giant ferns is released into modern air. For a brief moment, history becomes tangible, shared, and alive again. It's a reminder that the world we live in is not separate from what came before. The molecules of air that move through us today once moved through others, carrying the same chemical story forward. In some ways, these messages from the deep freeze resemble the fragments of old letters found in forgotten drawers. Some speak of ordinary days, seasons of calm and continuity. Others warn of upheaval, volcanoes, floods, shifts in temperature that transformed landscapes. Some are hopeful, showing resilience and recovery after catastrophe. Together they form a correspondence between the Earth and itself, a record of response and renewal. The Arctic, by preserving these messages, becomes a kind of planetary memory, one that can be read only through patience and care. Every drill site adds a new sentence to that memory. The deepest cores, 3 kilometers long, reach back almost 1 million years. Beyond that, the ice becomes too deformed to read cleanly, its messages smudged by movement and pressure. But even there, in the compressed and fractured layers, there is information. Crystals align, gas pockets merge, and what remains is still a testament to endurance. The deepest ice may no longer speak clearly, but its existence alone is a message that the planet keeps its own record, even when we can no longer decode it. The phrase deep freeze often conjures stillness, yet within the Arctic it represents motion of a different kind, motion stretched across time. The ice forms, melts and reforms over cycles that span tens of thousands of years. Its messages are updated slowly, layer by layer, in a conversation that never stops. When the polar night falls and temperatures drop, snowfall adds another page to that conversation. Each flake carries dust and salt from distant lands, trace elements of the living world and the breath of the atmosphere. Together they accumulate, preserving not just local conditions but global connections. The Arctic is the planet's inbox, collecting messages from every continent, every ocean, and every storm. Sometimes those messages are startlingly specific. In certain cores, scientists have found pollen grains from as far away as Africa, carried by atmospheric currents and deposited at the pole. In others, they found soot from industrial revolutions, traces of ancient wildfires, and even radioactive isotopes from mid-20th century bomb tests. Each foreign particle tells a story of movement, of how the entire Earth is linked by invisible exchanges. The Arctic records them all impartially. It doesn't distinguish between natural and human, between accident and intent. It simply archives. The ice doesn't judge, it remembers. Within the frozen layers are also messages about resilience. After catastrophic events, massive eruptions, abrupt temperature shifts, the record shows recovery. Temperatures stabilise, carbon levels fall, ecosystems rebound. It's a reminder that the planet can heal itself, but only over spans of time far longer than ours. The last ice age ended about 12,000 years ago, a blink in geological terms, yet long enough for entire human cultures to rise and fall. The Arctic still carries the imprint of that transformation, the rapid warming, the retreat of glaciers, the influx of meltwater into the oceans. Those layers read like a pulse quickening, the planet awakening from a long slumber. Now, in the 21st century, the ice shows a new acceleration, a quickening unlike any before. This time, the cause is us. It's hard not to hear the ice speaking in that pattern. The data forms curves and lines, but beneath them lies a story of rhythm disrupted. The deep freeze, once a stable archive, is thawing. The messages we extract now may be the last of their kind. As the Arctic warms, the older layers melt and flow into the ocean, erasing portions of the record forever. Information that took hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate can vanish in a single season. Every expedition to collect cores carries an urgency not just to learn, but to preserve what can still be read. Scientists hurry to decode the messages before they dissolve, knowing that once they're gone, that part of Earth's memory is gone too. In this sense, the ice is both messenger and message. It tells us about the past, but it also reacts to the present. Its melting is itself a statement, a visible expression of change. Each calving glacier, each shrinking sheet, is the Earth's way of writing in the language of transformation. The deep freeze that once preserved history now participates in it, contributing meltwater, releasing old gases, feeding feedback loops that accelerate its own disappearance. It's as if the archive has begun to speak louder, its voice no longer muffled by cold but released through the rush of thaw. Yet even in that loss there's continuity. The meltwater doesn't vanish, it joins the ocean, circulates, evaporates, and eventually falls again as snow. The messages from the deep freeze are not destroyed. They're rewritten, dispersed into new forms. Some will settle again at the poles, starting new records. Others will enter rivers, clouds, or living bodies. The planet's communication with itself continues, though the tone changes. What was once slow and stable becomes fast and volatile. But the conversation remains, carried forward by the same elements: air, water, carbon, and time. To think about this is to feel both awe and responsibility. The Arctic's ice is not just data. It's the living record of a planet that has been observing itself for millions of years. When we study it, we are reading messages that were never meant for us, but that we need to understand to continue existing here. Those messages are clear if we're willing to listen. Change is natural, but imbalance is dangerous. The world remembers everything we do, and life, in all its forms, depends on the stability of the systems the ice records so faithfully. Somewhere deep beneath the North Pole, far beyond reach, there are still untouched layers that have never seen light. Within them are the oldest messages of all, sealed under pressure, waiting for someone to decode them. They are fragments of atmosphere, traces of forgotten climates, and perhaps even the remains of microscopic life that once drifted in ancient seas. Whether or not we ever reach them, their existence matters. They remind us that beneath the surface the planet holds memories older than thought, older than our species, older than the concept of memory itself. The deep freeze keeps writing, line by line, and for now at least it's still writing in ice. Beneath the Arctic's vast plain of white, there are traces of worlds that no longer exist. They are not visible, not in any ordinary sense. You won't see the remains of forests rising through the ice, or the bones of extinct animals glinting in frozen sunlight. The ghosts of lost ecosystems are quieter than that. They exist as fragments buried in sediment, as molecules of ancient DNA floating in brine, as chemical signatures sealed away in the layered ice. Each of those fragments is a residue of something that once lived, something that thrived in a world long before ours. If the ice beneath the North Pole could thaw and speak, it would not tell a single story, but millions of overlapping ones. Of oceans that once teemed with strange creatures, of tundras that shifted and grew, of entire systems that rose, flourished, and faded into the cold. It holds their memory the way a photograph holds light, frozen, unchanging, but undeniably real. When scientists analyse sediments from beneath the Arctic seafloor, they find clues that the pole has not always been the lifeless desert we see today. There were times, tens of millions of years ago, when the region was warm enough for forests to grow, when shallow seas supported plankton blooms and fish, when temperatures rival those of modern temperate zones. The layers of mud and sand below the current ice sheet are filled with microfossils that tell this story. Pollen from ancient trees, shells of diatoms, fragments of algae that once captured sunlight in open water. Some layers even contain the remains of tiny insects and plant material carried by rivers from distant land masses. All of it points to a time when the Arctic was green, alive, and dynamic. A world lost beneath the frozen surface that replaced it. The transition from that living world to the one we know now wasn't sudden. It happened gradually, over millions of years, as tectonic plates shifted and ocean currents changed. The closing of ancient seaways, the tilting of the planet's axis, and the cooling of the atmosphere all worked together to trap heat differently. Slowly, the polar region became a freezer. Ice accumulated, seasons shortened, and the ecosystems that had flourished there withdrew southward. What remained, microbes, hardy plants, small organisms adapted to cold, either evolved to survive the freeze or vanished entirely. Yet even as those ecosystems disappeared, the Arctic preserved traces of them within its sediments and permafrost. The ghosts remained. One of the most haunting examples of this preservation comes from ice cores drilled deep into Greenland and northern Siberia. Within certain layers, scientists have found ancient DNA, not from living organisms, but from their long-decayed remains. These genetic fragments, though incomplete, reveal astonishing diversity. They come from grasses, shrubs, beetles, fungi, and microbes that lived during periods when the climate was far warmer than today. In a sense, the ice has become a natural archive of lost ecosystems, storing their molecular fingerprints even after their physical forms vanished. Each strand of DNA acts as a message, a record of the life that once covered the Arctic in green. When those sequences are decoded, they tell of wetlands, forests and meadows where there is now only ice and wind. Far below the ice sheet, where the ocean floor extends into basins and ridges, even older records exist. Sediments there contain the remains of planktonic organisms that thrived in ancient polar seas, their shells now compressed into thin layers of mineral. These microfossils serve as calendars of climate and ecology, marking periods when the ocean was rich in nutrients and oxygen, followed by times when it grew cold and barren. Some of the species found in those sediments no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Their delicate forms are preserved only as impressions, like ghosts imprinted in stone. Through them, scientists can reconstruct entire food webs that vanished millions of years ago, complex systems of life that operated under conditions radically different from the Arctic we know. It's easy to forget that the frozen north was once a cradle of life rather than its edge. During certain warm epochs, the Arctic Ocean may have been nearly ice-free year-round, its waters teeming with phytoplankton, its shores lined with conifer forests and flowering plants. Large mammals roamed its land masses and rivers flowed where glaciers now stand. Even as recently as the Pleistocene, much of the region supported vast grasslands that stretched across what is now the Bering Strait. These mammoth steppes were home to herds of giant herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, and woolly rhinoceroses, along with predators that hunted them under endless twilight skies. Today, all that remains of that ecosystem are scattered bones and DNA fragments preserved in permafrost. When scientists extract and sequence those remains, they can reconstruct entire populations, tracing their migrations and extinctions. It's like reading the ghostly ledger of a vanished biosphere. The ice doesn't just preserve physical remnants, it also captures chemical echoes. Isotopic patterns in the layers tell of shifts in vegetation, of forests replaced by tundra, of seas that grew saltier or fresher as glaciers advanced and retreated. Even the trapped gases in ancient bubbles carry the breath of these lost ecosystems. The carbon dioxide they produced, the oxygen they consumed, the methane that rose from decaying wetlands. Those gases may seem inert, but they are direct evidence of lives once lived and environments once thriving. They are the voices of the dead, transcribed into chemistry. The concept of ghosts may seem poetic, but in scientific terms it's remarkably precise. What the Arctic holds are residues, structures, molecules, and isotopic ratios that bear the imprint of biological activity long gone. These residues don't decay because the cold halts the chemical reactions that normally erase such evidence. They persist, silently, sometimes for millions of years, and when the ice melts, even slightly, those remnants are released back into the world, allowing us to study them and occasionally to revive them. In a few cases, scientists have successfully grown plants from seeds recovered from permafrost tens of thousands of years old. The plants sprouted as if no time had passed, their cells rehydrating, their genes expressing the same ancient instructions. It's as though the ghosts themselves briefly came back to life. This ability of frozen environments to preserve life's traces has reshaped how we think about extinction. For most of history, extinction was absolute, a disappearance without recovery. But the Arctic challenges that, in its deep freeze, extinction becomes less a final end and more a pause. Genetic material endures, waiting for conditions to allow it to speak again. Even species that have been gone for tens of millennia are not entirely erased. Their blueprints still exist in ice and soil, preserved with astonishing precision. This has led some researchers to dream of using that material to reconstruct lost species, not through fantasy, but through genetic science, sequencing, comparison, and perhaps one day revival. It's controversial, but it underscores the idea that the Arctic is not only a memorial to life's past, but a possible key to its rebirth. The ghosts of those lost ecosystems also live within modern ones. The microbes found in Arctic ice and permafrost are often direct descendants of ancient lineages. Some still carry genetic traits that evolved under conditions of warmth and abundance, traits that now serve them differently in the cold. Others may have been dormant for centuries before recent warming woke them. When scientists analyse Arctic soils, they find microbial communities that change dramatically as ice melts, revealing hidden diversity that had been frozen out of activity for generations. These microbes, tiny and unseen, are the last living representatives of vanished ecosystems, carrying ancient metabolisms that no longer have natural niches. They are the survivors of worlds that ended but left their chemistry behind. In this way, the Arctic is full of life that isn't exactly new, but isn't entirely ancient either. It's a continuum, a blending of past and present biology. The boundary between extinct and extant blurs here. A microbe revived from ice 100,000 years old shares the same earth, the same air as modern organisms. It continues its lineage without even realizing that eons have passed. This blending of eras creates a living mosaic of time, one where the past doesn't vanish, but quietly overlaps with the present. The Arctic, through its slow cycles of freezing and melting, becomes a bridge between eras, a natural time machine that doesn't move us backward, but brings fragments of ancient worlds forward instead. There's an unease that comes with that realization. As the ice retreats, it's not only releasing water and gases, it's releasing biology. Ancient spores, bacteria and viruses emerge from layers that haven't seen light since before humanity existed. Most are harmless, incapable of surviving in the oxygen-rich, warm world we inhabit. But some are more adaptable. In recent years, scientists have revived viruses from permafrost tens of thousands of years old that still retain the ability to infect simple hosts. These are not monsters, not cinematic threats, but they are reminders that the line between life and death is more fluid than we like to believe. The ghosts of lost ecosystems do not always stay ghosts. Sometimes they wake. Even when they don't, their remains influence the modern Arctic in subtler ways. As permafrost thaws, organic material from ancient plants and animals decomposes, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. These gases feed back into the atmosphere, amplifying warming and accelerating further melt. The process is self-reinforcing, a chain reaction that links the life of the past to the fate of the future. The ghosts are not passive. They participate in the present climate, shaping outcomes long after their time. In this sense, the ecosystems that once thrived in the Arctic are still influencing the world, though now as part of global chemistry rather than living communities. The sediments under the North Pole contain not only evidence of biological life but mineral traces of ancient rivers and lakes. These formations show that water once flowed freely across landscapes that are now frozen solid. The minerals deposited by those waters tell of cycles of evaporation, sedimentation, and biological productivity. Fossilized microorganisms embedded within them offer glimpses of aquatic ecosystems that resemble today's subtropical lagoons. Studying these formations allows scientists to reconstruct the Arctic's deep past, to see how entire climates shifted from lush to barren, from liquid to frozen. Each discovery is another message from those ghosts, another confirmation that the world has changed drastically before and will do so again. What makes these lost ecosystems haunting is not just that they're gone, but that they left behind evidence of thriving. The pollen, the fossils, the DNA, all show abundance, diversity, resilience. They remind us that the Arctic was once a place of life, not desolation. That knowledge changes how we perceive the present landscape. The endless ice and snow are not the original state of the North. They are its current mask. Beneath it lies a memory of growth and motion. To understand the Arctic fully is to hold both images at once, the living and the frozen, the vibrant and the still. Sometimes when researchers examine these remnants, they speak of feeling a strange intimacy with them. They look at the cellular structures of a leaf that last saw sunlight millions of years ago and realised that it performed the same photosynthesis that fuels modern forests. They extract DNA from a beetle preserved in permafrost and see genetic similarities to species still alive today. These connections collapse time. The distance between the living and the extinct shrinks to almost nothing. It's a reminder that life is a continuum, not a collection of isolated events. What we call extinction is simply the fading of one note in a long ongoing composition. The Arctic, then, is not just a place where life ends. It's a place where life pauses, where its traces accumulate and persist. The ghosts it holds are not echoes of despair, but records of endurance. They tell us that ecosystems, once thriving, can vanish from sight but not from history. Their chemistry continues to flow through the planet's systems, their carbon recycled, their energy redistributed. They're gone only in form, not in influence. The same molecules that built ancient forests and tundras now drift in the atmosphere, settle in oceans, or form the tissues of modern creatures. In that way, the ghosts are still here, still shaping the world in silence. To stand on the Arctic ice and think about what lies beneath is to sense that quiet persistence. The wind might be cold enough to sting, the landscape stark and colourless, but beneath your feet is a world layered with memory. Biological, geological, and chemical. The ghosts of lost ecosystems are not haunting in the usual sense. They are teachers, reminders of how resilient and fragile life can be at once. They show that change is constant, that survival takes many forms, and that even in disappearance, life leaves behind the tools for new beginnings. The Arctic is their resting place, but it's also their archive, their laboratory, and perhaps, someday, their birthplace again. The Arctic has always been more than a region. To scientists, it's a model, a reflection of other possibilities. What lies beneath the ice of the North Pole doesn't only reveal Earth's secrets, it holds hints of what might exist elsewhere, far beyond the reach of sunlight and ocean currents. The frozen layers under our feet are not just the remnants of our own planet's history. They are a mirror for other worlds, a way to understand how life might emerge, persist, or sleep on planets that orbit distant stars. In the quiet cold of the Arctic, where life slows to almost nothing and time stretches into immensity, the universe itself seems to echo. The same chemistry, the same resilience, the same delicate balance between survival and stillness that defines Earth's frozen north could exist on other worlds circling far-off suns. For as long as humans have looked up at the sky, we've wondered if we're alone. Ancient cultures saw constellations as stories. Modern science sees them as systems. But the question is the same. Could there be other places where life has taken hold? The Arctic, in its strangeness and beauty, gives us the closest example we have of what those places might be like. The deep freeze beneath the North Pole offers conditions that, in many ways, resemble those on other icy worlds in our solar system. It's a living laboratory, where biology meets extremes, where the familiar rules of ecology break down and new possibilities emerge. By studying what survives in Arctic ice, we're not just learning about Earth, we're learning how to look for life elsewhere. When researchers drill into frozen ground or deep sea ice and find living cells, they see more than microorganisms. They see analogues. The environment those cells inhabit, dark, cold, oxygen-poor, shielded from radiation, is strikingly similar to environments that may exist on moons like Europa, Enceladus, or Ganymede. These moons, covered in thick ice, are believed to hide oceans of liquid water beneath their crusts. The ice acts as insulation, just as it does in the Arctic, protecting what lies below from the vacuum of space. Underneath, heat from their cores may keep water from freezing entirely, creating a stable environment where chemistry could flourish. If microbial life can persist in the frozen seas beneath the North Pole, why not there? The connection between the Arctic and those distant worlds is not poetic. It's practical. Every discovery made in the ice provides data for astrobiologists who model potential habitats on other planets. When Arctic microbes are found metabolizing in sub-zero temperatures, when they generate energy through chemical reactions instead of sunlight, when they repair DNA damage after decades of dormancy, those findings feed directly into our understanding of how life could exist on icy moons. They show that biology does not need warmth or light. It only needs persistence and a way to use what's available. The Arctic becomes a scaled-down version of the cosmos, a place where the conditions of alien worlds are recreated naturally, right here on Earth. One of the most compelling parallels lies with Europa, Jupiter's icy moon. Beneath its frozen surface, scientists believe there is a vast ocean of salty water, possibly larger than all of Earth's oceans combined. That ocean is sealed under kilometers of ice, much like the Arctic waters beneath the North Pole, where darkness reigns and energy must come from below rather than above. Hydrothermal vents at the base of Europa's ocean, if they exist, could provide the same kind of chemical energy that sustains microbial communities on Earth's seafloor. The Arctic hosts similar systems where life thrives without sunlight, feeding on minerals and chemical gradients. By studying these environments, researchers can test equipment and hypotheses for future missions. In this way, the North Pole's frozen ocean becomes not just a place of study, but a rehearsal for exploration beyond Earth. Saturn's moon Enceladus offers another mirror. When spacecraft observed plumes of water vapor erupting from its south pole, the discovery sent ripples through science. Those plumes contain organic molecules, salts, and complex chemistry reminiscent of what's found in Arctic brine channels. In both cases, we see water interacting with rock, generating heat, and possibly creating niches where life could endure. The similarities are so strong that ice from Enceladus could, under the right conditions, harbour life forms almost indistinguishable from Arctic microbes. The Earth's poles are, in a sense, models for cosmic biology, showing how life might cling to existence in frozen oceans that never see sunlight. But the Arctic's lessons go deeper than analogues. They teach us something fundamental about what life is. We often define it by its dependence on warmth and energy, yet the ice shows another version. Life that adapts to stillness, that finds equilibrium in scarcity. The frozen world beneath the North Pole demonstrates that existence is not a matter of constant motion or change, but of balance. It proves that life's boundary is wider than we thought. On other worlds, that principle could hold true. Where water and chemistry meet, even in the coldest environments, the potential for life remains. The Arctic also teaches us how to look for that life. In the search for extraterrestrial organisms, direct observation is impossible. Instead, scientists rely on indirect signs, chemical imbalances, traces of gases like methane, or patterns in ice that suggest biological activity. These same clues are found in the Arctic. Within the ice, thin films of organic compounds line brine channels, altering the ice's texture and light reflection. Similar patterns could be visible on Europa or Enceladus, detectable through remote instruments. The study of Arctic ice has refined our ability to read these signs, teaching us how to distinguish biological influence from pure chemistry. Each discovery beneath the North Pole is a practice in interpretation, a lesson in listening to what frozen worlds can say without words. Perhaps the most revealing lesson from the Arctic is the concept of endurance. On Earth, life persists through change, adapting to new climates, shifting with continents and currents. In the Arctic, it persists through stillness. Some of the microorganisms found in permafrost are nearly identical to species that existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. Evolution has slowed almost to a halt, not because life failed, but because it found perfection in simplicity. These organisms have reached a balance so precise that any change would be detrimental. They are examples of stability, not stagnation. For astrobiologists, that's a revelation. It suggests that if life exists elsewhere, it might not evolve rapidly or grow complex. It might stay simple, steady, and enduring, invisible, but unbroken. This endurance challenges the way we imagine alien life. We picture strange creatures with limbs, eyes, or wings, but the Arctic suggests something quieter, microscopic life, resilient and efficient, waiting beneath ice for millions of years. It reminds us that intelligence or complexity aren't the only measures of significance. Persistence itself is a form of brilliance, one that the Arctic demonstrates flawlessly. The life under the ice doesn't strive for expansion, it focuses on continuation. It survives not through dominance but through balance. And that lesson extends far beyond Earth. There's another kind of mirror the Arctic provides, one not of physical resemblance but of principle. The balance between warmth and cold, energy and stillness, life and dormancy echoes the dynamics of the universe itself. Stars burn while planets freeze, yet both states coexist in equilibrium. The Arctic embodies that same tension. It's a boundary where extremes meet, where light fades and darkness begins, where the fragile and the eternal share the same space. That balance might be the true universal condition, and life's persistence within it may be the universe's most constant trait. In studying the Arctic, scientists also confront the limitations of human perception. We're built for moderate conditions, for warmth and light, for rhythms we can sense. The ice teaches humility by existing outside those bounds. Its temperatures are beyond comfort, its cycles beyond comprehension. To study it is to look at the edges of our own understanding. That experience mirrors the challenge of space exploration. Both require patience, precision, and acceptance that the universe does not conform to human timelines. In both the Arctic and the cosmos, discovery comes slowly, through layers of complexity and silence. The parallels extend to technology as well. Instruments designed to probe the Arctic's hidden ecosystems, submersibles, drills, sensors capable of functioning at extreme cold, are prototypes for machines that might one day explore alien oceans. Engineers test them in Arctic waters precisely because those conditions replicate the challenges of distant worlds. Each dive beneath the ice, each sample collected, is a rehearsal for journeys we haven't yet taken. The lessons learned there, about contamination, precision and fragility, will guide future missions searching for life beyond Earth. In this way, the North Pole is both laboratory and mirror, preparing us for encounters we can only imagine. Even the structure of Arctic ice tells us something universal. Its crystals form under specific pressures and temperatures, creating patterns that are remarkably similar to those found in cosmic ice, on comets, in interstellar dust, and on frozen moons. The chemistry of freezing, it turns out, is the same everywhere. The same interactions between water, salts, and organics that shape Arctic ice also occur in the farthest reaches of space. When we analyse meteorites or satellite data showing traces of frozen water, we're seeing echoes of the same process happening in the poles of our own world. The Arctic is not just a mirror of biology, it's a mirror of chemistry, of the fundamental processes that build and preserve matter throughout the cosmos. There's a humility in realising that the conditions we once thought rare are actually common. Ice, once seen as the enemy of life, might be its cradle. The Arctic proves that freezing doesn't mean lifelessness, it means stability. Ice preserves, protects, and provides structure. It isolates fragile chemistry from destruction, just as it does for microbes beneath the polar surface. On other worlds, ice might serve the same role, shielding nascent life from radiation and impact. It's possible that the universe's most habitable environments are not sunlit worlds like ours, but frozen oceans sealed in silence, where warmth seeps upward from below instead of downward from above. The Arctic also shows us how to read the signs of life's absence. Not every frozen world will host biology, but each will record its own chemistry. By studying sterile layers of ancient Arctic ice, those formed in times when life was minimal, we learn what non-biological signatures look like. We learn the difference between organic residue made by life and that produced by pure physics. This knowledge is crucial for interpreting data from space missions. Without it, we might mistake chemistry for biology or overlook subtle signs of real life. The Arctic refines our eyes, teaching us to see distinction in simplicity. But beyond science, there's an emotional resonance to these parallels. Standing on a frozen plain at the top of the Earth, under a sky so clear it seems infinite, one can't help but feel that the boundary between here and elsewhere is thinner than we think. The cold that numbs the skin is the same cold that rules most of the universe. The silence that stretches across the ice is the same silence that fills the void between stars. And beneath that surface, life continues anyway. Small, patient, unbothered by scale or distance. The Arctic reminds us that the conditions we find inhospitable might be someone else's home. It expands our imagination, grounding the search for other worlds not in fantasy, but in evidence lying just beneath our own feet. Perhaps that's the most profound reflection the Arctic offers. It tells us that our world and the cosmos are not opposites, but continuations of the same story. The frozen oceans of distant moons are not alien, they are familiar. The chemistry that may give rise to life elsewhere is the same that persists in our ice. And if we ever find organisms beyond Earth, they will not seem strange. They will seem inevitable, because the principles that sustain them are already written into the Arctic's frozen design. Every bubble of ancient air, every dormant cell, every layer of ice beneath the North Pole is a message not only from Earth's past, but from the universe's potential. The Arctic is both origin and reflection, archive and prophecy. It shows us what life can be when stripped of comfort, when reduced to its most essential truth, endurance. And as we continue to explore both the poles and the planets, that truth will remain our guide, that life, no matter where it exists, finds a way to persist, even in the coldest, darkest corners of creation. When the ice begins to melt, it does so quietly at first. There's no sudden roar, no violent tearing apart of the frozen world, only the slow sound of dripping, a rhythm so small and steady that it's almost invisible. But that sound marks the beginning of something enormous. It means that a part of the planet long held in stillness is starting to move again. In every drop of meltwater lies the release of something ancient, something that has waited in darkness for centuries or millennia. As the Arctic warms and its frozen layers soften, what emerges isn't only water, it's memory. The ice beneath the North Pole doesn't just melt, it awakens, freeing gases, sediments and microorganisms that have been trapped since before humanity existed. The thaw is not just a transformation of a landscape, it's a re-entry of the past into the present. When people think of melting ice, they often imagine it as loss, a vanishing of glaciers, shrinking of habitats, rising of seas. And it is those things. But it is also revelation. Each layer of ice that turns to water reveals what it has been holding. Traces of extinct ecosystems, frozen atmospheres, fragments of DNA, spores and cells that once belonged to living systems now long gone. When those layers dissolve, they release not just physical matter, but context. It's as though the Arctic has been writing a story for hundreds of thousands of years, one line per snowfall, and now the ink is beginning to run, the letters smudging as they rejoin the world. The past is becoming liquid again. At first, this awakening happens at the microscopic level. In the meltwater that pools across the surface, microorganisms stir. Some are modern species that have survived cycles of freezing and thawing every year, accustomed to the rhythm of cold and warmth. But others are far older. They come from deeper layers, where they have been sealed away for ages. When those ancient cells touch liquid water for the first time in thousands of years, some revive. They begin to metabolize, to divide slowly, to rejoin the living world. To the eye, nothing changes, the water remains clear, the ice transparent. But under a microscope, time collapses. Life that once belonged to prehistoric climates starts moving again in the modern one. The boundary between then and now dissolves as easily as ice in sunlight. This reawakening is both scientific wonder and ecological risk. Not every organism that returns from the ice fits comfortably into the world that now exists. Most of these ancient microbes are harmless, but a few are not. Some may carry traits that modern ecosystems are unprepared for. Others may interact with existing bacteria in ways we can't predict. It's not fantasy to imagine old diseases emerging from thawing permafrost. Such things have already been observed, but the larger concern isn't any single organism, it's the massive invisible change in chemistry and biology that follows the melt. The Arctic's ice has acted as a lid on an ancient laboratory, sealing away not just life but the gases and organic material that those lives produced. When it opens, it releases more than water, it alters the atmosphere itself. Inside the permafrost, for example, there are immense reserves of carbon locked in frozen soil and decaying vegetation. As the ground thaws, microorganisms begin to decompose that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the air. These gases amplify the greenhouse effect, accelerating warming, which in turn causes more thawing, a loop that feeds itself, drawing energy from the planet's own stored history. In this way, the past doesn't only awaken, it participates in shaping the future. The more the ice melts, the more active that process becomes, and the more influence the ancient carbon holds over the modern atmosphere. The very breath of prehistoric worlds, long trapped beneath ice, is entering our skies again. What makes this transformation unsettling is its scale. Every degree of warming multiplies the amount of meltwater flowing into the ocean, the amount of permafrost releasing gas, the number of ancient systems reactivated. On maps, these changes look gradual, a reduction of white area, a shift of lines. But on the ground, they are immense. Rivers form where there were none, shorelines retreat, and the ice that once reflected sunlight begins to absorb it instead. What was once a stable, self-regulating system becomes dynamic, restless. The Arctic begins to resemble the world it was before the deep freeze, a place of flowing water and biological exchange, but in a context that is no longer balanced. Within that flux, ancient sediments re-enter circulation. The meltwater carries particles from old glacial layers into modern seas, mixing ancient nutrients with contemporary ecosystems. In some areas, this influx sparks brief bursts of productivity. Phytoplankton bloom, feeding fish and seabirds, creating temporary richness in places once barren. But this richness is unstable, like a flare that burns too quickly. The systems that emerge are untested, the equilibrium fragile. The Arctic Ocean becomes both a nursery and a graveyard, creating and consuming life in cycles that grow shorter each year. The old and the new merge, and the result is something we've never seen before, a hybrid ecology built from remnants of the past. There's an irony in this because the Arctic's awakening mirrors, in a way, humanity's own. For centuries we treated the poles as static, eternal boundaries, but as they change, they force us to confront our role in that change. The melt is not just a geological event, it's a reflection of our collective impact. The gases we've released into the atmosphere have reached even here, altering a system that predates civilization itself. And now that system is responding. The ice melts, the past awakens, and in doing so it reminds us that the Earth's memory is not passive. It reacts. It keeps score in temperature, in chemistry, in the quiet rearrangement of its frozen archives. When explorers first documented glaciers carving into the ocean, they described it as a kind of birth, massive, slow, yet alive. Icebergs detached from the sheets like newborn giants, carrying within them layers of ancient air and sediment. Today, that process is accelerating. The Arctic is birthing the past at a rate the planet has never witnessed. Every iceberg that melts releases not only water, but data, history, and unseen matter. In this sense, the melt isn't an erasure, it's an unveiling. The problem is that the revelation comes faster than we can absorb it. The speed of change is greater than our capacity to understand it, and the result is a strange tension between fascination and fear, between discovery and loss. There's something almost human in the way the Arctic reveals its history. The melting ice is like memory resurfacing after long suppression, beautiful in its detail, painful in its consequences. As the old layers dissolve, they expose the planet's most intimate records, the cycles of warming and cooling, the eruptions, the extinctions, the recoveries. Those patterns show that change is constant, that nothing in nature is fixed. But they also show that every system has thresholds, points beyond which equilibrium collapses. The Arctic is nearing such thresholds now. The frozen past is returning too quickly, and its release is rewriting the present. Still, within that danger lies knowledge. Every piece of data recovered from melting ice deepens our understanding of how Earth behaves. When scientists measure the gases emerging from thawing ground, they learn about feedback loops that shape planetary climate. When they revive microbes from ancient layers, they study the limits of biological endurance. When they map the sediments flowing into the sea, they trace the history of ocean circulation. The Arctic's loss, tragic as it is also revelation. It's the planet showing us its inner workings in real time. Systems that were once hidden behind miles of ice now visible, measurable, alive. It's as though Earth itself has begun to explain its own biography, even as it changes. There's also a quiet beauty in what the melt uncovers. Beneath retreating glaciers, scientists have found landscapes that haven't seen the sky in tens of thousands of years. Valleys carved by ancient rivers, lake beds filled with sediment that records the planet's distant moods. Some of these terrains are startlingly preserved. Moss and roots appear as though they had only recently died, their colours intact, their structures unbroken. When carbon dated, they turn out to be older than civilization. These are not ruins, but time capsules, opened by the warmth of the modern age. The same applies to bones, wood, and even pollen, all returning to light after ages in shadow. The Earth is revealing its forgotten architecture, but with every revelation comes a question. What happens when everything is uncovered? The Arctic's frozen vault has stored the planet's memory for millennia. As it melts, that archive becomes unreadable. Data is lost, the oldest layers dissolve, and the continuous record of Earth's climate becomes fragmented. The process is irreversible. Once the ice becomes water, its structure and the information within is gone. This is the paradox of awakening. To reveal the past, we must destroy it. Every discovery from melting ice comes at the cost of something that can never be recovered. It's as if we're reading a book that erases itself as we turn the pages. Still, the knowledge we gain may be what helps us preserve what remains. The study of Arctic melt has already reshaped how we model climate, how we predict sea level rise, how we understand carbon cycling. Each measurement, each sample, adds another piece to the puzzle of how to live in balance with the planet's systems. The ice, even in its disappearance, continues to teach. Its melting is both a warning and a lesson in connection. It shows that no part of the Earth exists in isolation, that the boundaries between time periods and ecosystems are fluid, that the past is not gone but constantly folding into the present. For all its magnitude, though, the process is deeply personal. To stand on melting ice and feel it shift under your feet is to feel the planet moving beneath you. It's to sense the weight of history turning liquid, flowing outward into rivers and seas. It's a quiet, humbling awareness that the ground you stand on is temporary, that even the hardest substance can become transient given time and warmth. The Arctic has always seemed eternal, a fixed point in a changing world. But now it is the world's most fluid place, changing faster than any other, carrying the past downstream. If there's a single truth in this transformation, it's that awakening doesn't always mean comfort. Sometimes it means confrontation. The ice's release forces us to see not only what came before us, but what we've done. The gases it emits, the sea levels it alters, the storms it influences. They're all responses to a larger system we've disrupted. Yet even in that confrontation there's hope. The same knowledge that reveals the damage also points toward understanding, and understanding is where change begins. The Arctic, even as it melts, continues to serve as the planet's teacher, its most honest and unflinching witness. The melting ice doesn't bring silence, it brings sound, the crack of glaciers, the rush of meltwater, the movement of newly exposed Earth. It's the sound of time rejoining itself, of the frozen centuries flowing back into circulation. The past is no longer sealed. It moves through air and water, mingling with the present. Each drop carries something of what once was, and in doing so it becomes part of what is. The awakening of the ice is not a singular event. It's a process, one that connects history to chemistry, memory to matter. As the Arctic transforms, it reminds us that nothing on Earth is truly gone, only waiting to return when conditions allow. The world beneath the North Pole is not silent anymore. The ice that once kept it sealed is thinning, and the stories it held are escaping into the atmosphere, into the ocean, into us. They are stories of cycles, of endurance, of change. They remind us that the Earth is not static, that it is capable of both creation and renewal. The melting of the Arctic may be one of the great challenges of our time, but it's also a moment of revelation unlike any before. The past is awakening, not to repeat itself, but to be understood before it transforms once more. The Arctic was once thought to be untouched, a place so remote that nothing human could truly alter it. For centuries it seemed eternal, cold, distant, indifferent to our presence. The explorers who reached its edge often described it as another planet, a realm beyond civilization's reach. Yet today, it is clear that the boundary between the human world and the frozen world no longer exists. The same breath we exhale, the same energy we burn, the same choices we make in cities thousands of kilometers away all reach here eventually. The air carries our heat, the oceans our carbon, and the atmosphere our fingerprints. Even beneath the North Pole, where no one lives and almost nothing grows, our influence can be measured. The ice, once purely natural, now contains traces of us. Particles of soot, fibres of plastic, isotopes from nuclear tests, and chemicals from industries that have never seen snow. The hidden world beneath the Arctic no longer belongs only to nature. It has become a reflection of human behaviour, a quiet record of our reach. This transformation didn't happen suddenly. It began subtly, almost invisibly, as industrialisation spread across the world. Factories burned coal, forests were cleared, oil wells opened, engines turned. Each act released gases into the atmosphere, particles into the air, and heat into the climate system. Those substances didn't stay local. They moved with wind and weather, rising into global circulation. The Arctic, positioned at the top of that circulation, became their final destination. Over time, the cold captured what the warm world expelled. Soot from distant cities fell with snowflakes. Traces of pesticides used on crops half a world away settled in the polar air. Even microplastics, those fragments smaller than a grain of sand, drifted northward, carried by ocean currents, accumulating in ice, snow, and seawater. What was once the cleanest place on Earth became a silent collection site for humanity's debris. When scientists examine Arctic ice cores from recent centuries, they can pinpoint the beginning of this influence. Layers that predate the Industrial Revolution are pristine, their gases reflecting natural cycles of carbon and oxygen. Then, suddenly, a new pattern appears, one that aligns perfectly with human history. Carbon dioxide rises sharply, methane increases. Particulate matter from fossil fuel combustion leaves dark streaks visible even to the naked eye. In some cores there's a distinct signature of lead, matching the era of widespread gasoline use. In others, traces of radioactive isotopes from mid-20th century nuclear tests appear. The ice became an archive not only of planetary change but of human activity. It records our inventions, our industries, our wars, and our habits as clearly as it records ancient volcanoes and meteor impacts. In a way, the Arctic has become our biography written in frozen form. The consequences of this reach are not only chemical, they're ecological, geological, even philosophical. The presence of humans in the Arctic is no longer defined by explorers planting flags or scientists drilling cores. It's defined by what we've left behind unintentionally. The soot that darkens ice reduces its reflectivity, causing it to absorb more sunlight and melt faster. The warming caused by greenhouse gases accelerates that melt, which in turn releases more carbon and methane from permafrost. The feedback loops intensify, and the frozen systems that once regulated Earth's temperature begin to shift unpredictably. In essence, humanity has become part of the Arctic's machinery, not as an observer, but as driver. The line between human and natural processes is now blurred beyond distinction. This integration has also changed how we study the region. Once, research focused on mapping its geography and cataloguing its species. Now much of the work involves tracing human influence, how pollutants move, how temperatures rise, how ecosystems adjust. The Arctic has become a measure of our collective impact. Every sample taken from its snow or water tells a story not only of nature but of civilization's shadow. There are synthetic chemicals in polar bears' fat, industrial nitrates in Arctic moss, and microplastics in deep-sea sediments. Even in the remotest ice cores, taken from places where no human has ever stood, there are traces of our modern world. The Arctic is no longer untouched, it's evidence. It proves that humanity's reach has become planetary. Yet despite that reach, our understanding of the Arctic's hidden world is still limited. Much of it remains unexplored, difficult to access, and easy to disrupt. The ice moves, the weather shifts, and the equipment required to study it must withstand conditions that test even modern technology. Each expedition to the north carries risk, not only physical danger, but the risk of altering what we hope to understand. The act of measurement itself can change the system. A drilling rig may release trapped gases, a submersible may disturb sediments that have lain undisturbed for ages. In this sense, human observation is never neutral. The more we learn about the Arctic, the more we become part of its unfolding story. The hidden world beneath the ice reacts not only to global climate, but to the curiosity that seeks to unveil it. Still, it is through that curiosity that we've come to understand the Arctic's importance to the planet as a whole. The polar regions act as stabilizers for Earth's climate. Their ice reflects sunlight, their cold drives ocean currents, their air circulates and cools the atmosphere. When those systems change, the effects ripple outward to every latitude. Sea levels rise, weather patterns shift, ecosystems far from the poles adjust. The Arctic is not an isolated region. It's a core mechanism in the planet's design. To alter it is to alter the entire system, and that is precisely what we have done, whether we intended to or not. Some of the most telling evidence of this lies in temperature data. The Arctic is warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average. That acceleration isn't uniform, it varies by region and season, but the trend is unmistakable. Permafrost that has remained frozen for tens of thousands of years is thawing. Sea ice that once lasted year-round now melts in summer. The old rhythm of freezing and refreezing has been interrupted, replaced by cycles that move too quickly for ecosystems to adapt. The melting ice exposes dark ocean water, which absorbs more heat, further accelerating the process. The Arctic is caught in a feedback loop of its own making, fueled by human influence and natural response. This transformation doesn't stop at the pole. It extends through wind, ocean, and weather to the rest of the world. As these changes unfold, the boundary between the visible and the hidden shifts. What was once buried beneath ice becomes exposed, and what was once invisible in data becomes measurable. the thaw reveals the structures of the past, ancient soils, long frozen rivers, preserved remains of extinct animals, and simultaneously exposes the vulnerabilities of the present. In some places, the melting ground destabilizes infrastructure built on permafrost. Pipelines, research stations, entire communities. Roads buckle, buildings tilt and coastlines erode into the sea. The physical manifestation of climate change is nowhere clearer than here, where human settlement meets geological memory. The Arctic, long imagined as eternal, is now changing faster than any other part of the planet, and we are part of that change, both cause and witness. There's an irony in how the human hand has shaped this hidden world. We have, without intent, turned the Arctic into a mirror of our global influence. It reflects not only our industrial emissions but our technological ambitions. Satellites orbit overhead, tracking the ice as it recedes, measuring its thickness, temperature and motion. Drones and sensors record the chemistry of air and water in real time. Artificial intelligence processes the data, modelling the future of a region few will ever visit in person. The Arctic has become one of the most monitored environments on Earth, not because we live there, but because we can't afford to ignore it. Our machines are the new explorers, mapping a world that is both ancient and newly fragile. The data they send back is as much a message about ourselves as about the ice. It shows us what happens when a species becomes global in scale but local in perspective. Still, there's more to our connection with the Arctic than science or consequence. There's also responsibility. The changes happening beneath the ice are not random. They are responses to choices we've made. The warmth that melts glaciers, the particles that darken snow, the chemicals that enter Arctic waters, all originate from human activity. And yet, for all the damage, the Arctic also demonstrates the possibility of resilience. Even as it melts, life adapts. Species shift their ranges, microbial communities reorganize, and new ecosystems emerge in places once sterile. It's a reminder that the planet, while vulnerable, is not defenseless. What we alter, it adjusts to, but at a cost that we will inevitably share. That cost is not limited to environmental change, it's cultural as well. Indigenous peoples who have lived in the Arctic for millennia are among the first to feel the full weight of transformation. Their lands, livelihoods and traditions are tied to the rhythms of ice and migration, to the cycles that are now breaking apart. For them, the melting of the Arctic is not an abstract concept, it's daily reality. Yet their knowledge, accumulated through generations of observation, remains one of the most valuable sources of insight we have. They understand the ice not as a resource or a threat, but as a living system. Their stories, passed down through oral tradition, describe the same processes that satellites now measure. In listening to those voices, we find a perspective that science alone cannot provide. A relationship with the Arctic built on respect rather than extraction. This is perhaps where the human hand meets the hidden world most profoundly, not in the act of change, but in the act of recognition. For centuries we saw the Arctic as distant, irrelevant, or exploitable. Now, as its transformation becomes undeniable, we begin to see it as part of ourselves. The line between us and it dissolves. Our breath warms its air, our waste marks its snow, our choices shape its fate. In return, its changes shape ours. Through rising seas, shifting weather, altered food systems. The Arctic is not a faraway world anymore. It's the centre of a feedback loop that binds every living thing on Earth. To understand this hidden world fully is to accept that it's no longer separate from humanity. It is both victim and participant in our collective experiment. The Arctic holds our pollutants, reflects our heat, and measures our time. But it also holds our potential, the chance to learn, to adapt, to change course. The same tools that allow us to see its decline can help us mitigate it. The same curiosity that brought us here can inspire restraint. In that sense, The human hand is not only a force of destruction, it can be one of repair. The ice still listens, the world beneath it still responds. Even now, as the frozen north shifts, it continues to remind us of our place in the larger pattern. We are not separate from the systems we study. We are woven into them. The hidden world beneath the ice and the visible world above it are part of the same continuum, responding to the same physics, the same chemistry, the same shared fate. The Arctic reveals this truth with clarity few other places can offer. It doesn't accuse or forgive, it simply reflects. And what it reflects, more clearly than ever, is us. The Arctic is more than a landscape. It is memory in physical form, a record written not in ink or paper, but in ice and silence. Every layer of snow that settles on the pole becomes part of that memory, pressed down by time until it hardens into history. Within those layers, air is captured, dust is sealed, and traces of life are stored. Each particle is a witness, each bubble a fragment of breath from an age long before our own. When we study the North, we're not merely observing a region, we are reading the planet's mind. The frozen ground and endless sheets of ice serve as the memory banks of Earth itself, preserving the events, climates, and lives that came before us in a form that endures beyond comprehension. To understand the Arctic is to understand how the world remembers. Memory for humans is fragile. It fades, shifts, and rewrites itself. The Arctic, by contrast, remembers everything. It does not choose or forget. It records volcanic ash, traces of pollen, soot from ancient fires, and the molecular imprint of the air we breathe. It stores every fluctuation of temperature, every alteration in atmospheric chemistry, every eruption and extinction. It remembers not just what has happened, but how it felt to the planet itself. In its layers, we can measure stress and recovery, catastrophe and calm, and even the smallest variations in the rhythm of seasons that no living creature could perceive directly. The North functions as the Earth's memory because it cannot lie. Its record is physical, elemental, and permanent until it melts. And as that ice begins to vanish, it's as though the planet's recollection is starting to blur. The idea that the Arctic holds memory isn't just metaphorical, it's measurable. Scientists can analyze ice cores like pages in a diary, reading the past in increments of millimeters. Each ring corresponds to a year, sometimes even a season. Within those rings are isotopes that reveal temperature, dust that marks volcanic winters, and traces of gases that reflect the state of the atmosphere. When compared, these layers form timelines stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. They show the cycles of glaciation and thaw, the swings of carbon dioxide and methane, the rise and fall of ocean levels. They reveal patterns of repetition that define Earth's climate, patterns that now, in our time, are breaking. The Arctic's memory does not simply tell us what was, it warns us what happens when the rhythm changes. But the memory of the North isn't confined to its ice, it's written across its terrain as well. The permafrost beneath tundra plains contains the remnants of ancient soils, once fertile ecosystems frozen in place. When those layers thaw, they expose roots, leaves, and bones so well preserved that they seem alive. In their tissues lie stories of the environments they once inhabited, lush grasslands stretching across what is now barren plain, forests that stood where there is now only snow. Even the rocks carry memory. Their strata reveal the advance and retreat of glaciers, the pressure of ice sheets kilometers thick, the carving of valleys and fjords over epochs of movement. To walk through the Arctic is to walk through time itself, each step a crossing over another era's footprint. The animals that live there carry memory in their bodies as well. The DNA of Arctic species is a record of adaptation, genes shaped by cold, scarcity, and endurance. Polar bears, seals, and whales all bear molecular evidence of survival through shifting ice ages. Their migrations follow ancient routes encoded by instinct, repeating patterns laid down by generations long gone. The North remembers through them, using life itself as a vessel. Even the simplest microorganisms, buried deep beneath ice or frozen in brine, carry the planet's genetic past forward. When those cells revive, they bring the memory of ancient ecosystems into the present, bridging gaps that no other archive could fill. The Arctic's memory is not only geological, it is biological, living and evolving even as it preserves the traces of what came before. There's something profound about how memory functions in this place. It's not linear, not orderly. Unlike a written record, it doesn't separate events neatly. Layers overlap, merge, compress, distort under pressure. Old ice migrates downward, folding into new formations. The Arctic's memory is constantly rewriting itself while preserving the core of its content. It behaves much like the human mind in that way, selective, shaped by forces beyond its control but fundamentally unable to forget. The difference is that its timescale dwarfs ours. Where we remember decades, the ice remembers ages. Where we speak of history, it speaks of evolution. The Arctic holds the long view, the version of memory that belongs not to species but to the planet itself. When researchers drill into those memories, they often describe the experience with reverence. The deeper the core, the more distant the era it represents. At certain depths, they are touching air that was last free when mammoths roamed, when early humans had barely learned to use fire. That air is perfectly preserved. The same molecules once drawn into ancient lungs now resting in glass vials under laboratory light. There's a strange intimacy in that, an unbroken line between beings separated by hundreds of millennia. The Arctic's memory allows such connections to exist. It bridges time through chemistry, through pressure, through cold. It is the closest thing we have to time travel that doesn't distort reality. In recent years, however, this memory has begun to fade. The rising temperatures that melt ice also erase its record. Once a layer turns to water, the gases within it escape, the structure collapses, and the story it held is gone forever. Scientists race to collect cores before they vanish, knowing that each lost glacier means a lost chapter in Earth's history. The Arctic's memory is not infinite. It depends on cold to endure. Without it, the planet begins to forget. What disappears is not just data, it's continuity. The long, unbroken record of climate, atmosphere, and life becomes fragmented. It's like losing a language that no one else speaks. Once gone, it cannot be recreated. This forgetting isn't limited to ice. As permafrost thaws, organic matter decomposes, releasing carbon that was locked away for thousands of years. The act of remembering, the storage of carbon in frozen ground, becomes the act of release. The past returns, not as knowledge but as heat. It's a cruel inversion. The more memory we awaken, the more change we unleash. The Arctic, in trying to tell its story, accelerates its own transformation. The line between preservation and destruction becomes impossibly thin. Yet even in that paradox there's meaning. The melting of the Arctic is both loss and revelation. In its final stages, the memory of the North speaks louder than ever before. Beyond data and science, there's another kind of memory that lives in this place, the human kind. For the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, memory is not frozen in ice. It's carried in stories, songs, and practices that connect people to the land. These traditions hold knowledge about the behavior of animals, the patterns of ice, the changes in wind and light that mark the passing seasons. For generations, this oral history has guided survival in an environment that outsiders once called uninhabitable. It represents a living form of memory, one that exists in harmony with the land rather than apart from it. And unlike written science, it doesn't separate observation from experience. It understands the Arctic as both environment and identity. When modern scientists speak of melting permafrost and shifting ecosystems, they're often describing in data what indigenous communities have felt directly for decades. The Arctic's memory in this sense is shared between the land and those who live closest to it. That shared memory carries wisdom that the world needs now more than ever. It reminds us that the planet's systems are cyclical, interconnected and responsive. It teaches that survival depends not on dominance but on balance. The indigenous understanding of the Arctic sees change not as destruction, but as transformation, an ongoing process that requires respect and adaptation. This perspective aligns perfectly with what the ice tells us scientifically, that stability is temporary, that every action ripples through the system, that the future is built from the remnants of the past. The memory of the North is thus both cultural and ecological, a bridge between knowledge systems that together form a more complete picture of reality. As the Arctic continues to change, humanity finds itself woven deeper into its memory. The chemical traces of our era, the soot, the microplastics, the artificial isotopes, will remain in the ice for as long as any of it survives. Future civilizations, if they exist, will find those layers and know us by them. They will see the spike of carbon dioxide, the strange materials that appeared suddenly in the geological record, the abrupt warming that followed. They will read our time as we read the fossils of ancient worlds. We have become part of the Arctic's memory whether we intended to or not. The difference is that we can still decide what that memory says about us. The North, in its quiet persistence, teaches something about how memory shapes identity. The ice does not mourn or celebrate, it simply records. In doing so, it shows that to remember is not necessarily to feel, but to preserve truth. For humanity, that lesson is both humbling and clarifying. The planet doesn't remember us out of sentiment, it remembers because physics demands it. Every action leaves a mark, every breath a trace, every emission a record. The Arctic is where those traces accumulate, condensed into layers that tell the truth about who we are. When we look at those cores, we're not seeing the past as it was. We're seeing the consequences of everything that has ever been done. There's something profoundly still about that realization. In the Arctic, memory has no agenda. It exists because the conditions allow it to, and yet through it, the world achieves continuity. The ice connects ages, the permafrost links life and death, and the cycles of freezing and melting ensure that memory is never entirely lost, only transformed. Even if all the ice were to melt, the oceans would carry traces of what once was. The sediments would settle, preserving a new record beneath the waves. The Arctic's form may change, but its function as memory will persist in different shapes. The planet does not stop remembering. It simply shifts where and how it stores its recollections. To think of the North this way is to see it not as a place, but as a process. Memory is not static. It's movement through time. Each snowfall adds a new thought. Each thaw releases an old one. The Arctic breathes history in and out, turning it over endlessly. Its vast stillness is deceptive. Beneath it, everything is in flux. That's what makes it so vital. It holds the tension between permanence and change, between forgetting and remembering. It is both archive and renewal, death and rebirth. In that balance lies the secret of endurance. As humanity continues to navigate a warming world, the memory of the North will remain our greatest teacher. It shows us how interconnected the systems of Earth truly are, how delicate their balances can be, and how resilient they remain when respected. It reminds us that forgetting our impact does not erase it, that the past is never truly gone, and that the choices we make now will become tomorrow's record. To look into the Arctic's memory is to look at ourselves, not as individuals, but as a species etched into the ice. The layers that once held the breath of mammoths now hold ours. The continuum is unbroken, and so the North endures, not as a symbol of isolation but of connection. It remembers the first snows, the first fires, the first life that braved its cold. It remembers the rise and fall of climates, the birth and extinction of species, the arrival of humanity, and the mark we've left. It remembers not to condemn or to praise, but simply because that is what the world does. It keeps record of itself, and as long as some part of it remains frozen, that memory will continue to exist, holding within it the story of everything that ever touched the planet's surface, every breath that ever met its air, every silence that ever filled its sky. The Arctic has always carried an illusion of stillness. To stand at the top of the world is to be surrounded by quiet so deep it feels endless, as if even time itself pauses to listen. The air barely moves, the snow absorbs sound, and beneath the ice there is no wind, no voices, no heartbeat that we can hear. It seems lifeless, frozen into a permanent state of waiting. Yet that impression, like most things seen from a distance, is misleading. Beneath that silence, everything is moving. The ice is shifting, the currents are circulating, the microbes are dividing slowly, and the chemical processes that sustain existence continue without pause. The Arctic is not dead. It is alive in a way that defies our usual sense of life. Its motion is slower, its rhythm stretched across centuries, but it breathes all the same. Deep under the frozen surface, where light never penetrates and temperatures remain far below freezing, there are ecosystems as complex as any rainforest. They don't depend on sunlight, but on chemical energy drawn from minerals and pressure. Microbes feed on compounds like methane, sulfur, and iron, transforming them into the foundation of miniature food webs that operate entirely in darkness. These organisms have adapted to conditions that would destroy most life: ice crystals that puncture cell walls, brine channels that reach salinity levels beyond seawater, and complete absence of warmth. They survive by becoming nearly still, reducing their metabolism to a trace, functioning just enough to repair damage and maintain structure. Some divide once every few decades. Some might wait centuries between moments of true activity. To us, that seems indistinguishable from death. But for them it is continuity. Their stillness is not an end. It is a strategy. Scientists who study these deep ecosystems have learned to approach them with patience. Samples collected from under the ice reveal microbial communities that have remained stable for tens of thousands of years. In laboratory experiments, when those samples are thawed gently and given liquid water, the organisms revive almost immediately. They move, consume, reproduce, and interact as if no time had passed at all. It's as though the Arctic has been holding a continuous breath, exhaling only when touched by warmth. What we call dormancy is simply another mode of existence, one that life invented to endure a planet that changes faster than it can adapt. The fact that such life persists beneath the Arctic's silence is not just remarkable, it's instructive. It shows that survival is not always about movement or expansion. Sometimes it's about endurance through stillness. Even the ice itself participates in this quiet life. Within its crystalline structure are tiny channels filled with brine and trapped gases. These channels, barely wider than a human hair, form an interconnected network that allows microscopic organisms to move, exchange nutrients, and communicate chemically. It's a hidden infrastructure of survival, built into the ice from the moment it forms. As the temperature changes, the channels expand or contract, altering the environment in subtle ways. This constant adjustment means that even frozen systems are dynamic. Beneath what looks static from above, there is perpetual negotiation between water, salt, pressure, and biology. The Arctic is not frozen solid. It is frozen in motion. In the depths of the Arctic Ocean, beneath layers of ice that drift and crack like shifting continents, life takes on other forms. Entire communities of fish, invertebrates, and plankton have adapted to perpetual twilight. Some glow with bioluminescence, casting faint blue light into the dark water, while others navigate through sensory systems that detect vibration rather than sight. Their food ultimately comes from below, from vents and currents that bring minerals upward, sustaining a chain of existence that loops endlessly through chemical reactions rather than sunlight. Every movement, every interaction operates in silence. The absence of sound is not emptiness, it is equilibrium. Above these depths, the ice serves as both barrier and protector. It isolates the ecosystems below from storms and radiation, creating one of the most stable environments on Earth. Within that stability, evolution follows paths different from anywhere else. Organisms here are not built for speed or aggression. They are built for endurance and cooperation. Even predators move slowly, conserving energy, waiting for the right moment. The stillness that defines the Arctic is not a lack of activity. It's a balance between scarcity and survival. Everything that lives beneath the silence has found a way to exist on minimal energy, turning limitation into longevity. This endurance extends to the microscopic level. In the sediments beneath the ocean floor, scientists have found cells so old that they predate modern ecosystems. Some have remained dormant for millions of years, preserved by the cold and lack of oxygen. When exposed to favourable conditions, they begin to metabolize again, proving that life can pause almost indefinitely and still resume. These discoveries blur the line between life and matter, between animation and suspension. They show that even in environments where nothing appears to change, processes continue at a molecular level. Enzymes function, membranes maintain structure, and DNA slowly repairs itself. Life, in its most fundamental form, is self-sustaining persistence. The realization that the Arctic is alive beneath its silence changes how we see the planet itself. It means that stillness is not death. It is simply a different tempo of existence. The cycles that govern this region operate over spans of time that humans rarely consider. Ice forming over centuries, melting over millennia, currents shifting slowly through deep channels. Even the geological movements beneath the seafloor occur in rhythms that make our history seem brief. When we talk about the Arctic melting, we are witnessing one movement in a much larger composition, one verse in a song the planet has been singing since long before we could listen. That understanding doesn't erase the urgency of the present, but it reframes it. The Arctic will not vanish completely. It will transform, as it always has. What we lose is the stability that allowed us to observe it in one state for so long. That transformation affects not only ice and water, but the invisible connections that run through air and ocean. As the Arctic warms, its hidden life changes pace. Dormant microbes become active sooner, altering chemical balances in ways we're only beginning to understand. Methane-consuming bacteria shift their metabolism, reducing some emissions but increasing others. Nutrient cycles accelerate, feeding phytoplankton blooms that spread under thinning ice. These changes ripple outward, linking the Arctic to global systems. The life beneath the silence does not exist in isolation. It's part of the planet's metabolism. The deep currents that circulate through the Arctic Ocean eventually feed into other seas, carrying the signatures of its hidden life across hemispheres. In this sense, every breath we take, every grain of food that grows under sunlight, is connected in some small way to what happens under the ice. When the ice thins, the silence begins to sound different. Water moves more freely, carrying distant echoes through the dark. Whales and seals navigate new routes, their songs travelling farther than before. The very acoustics of the Arctic are changing, and with them, the communication between species that have relied on sound for navigation and survival. The silence that once defined the region becomes layered with new frequencies, some natural, some from human activity. Ships now traverse waters that were once impassable, their engines adding low vibrations to the soundscape. For the life that evolved in stillness, these intrusions represent more than noise, they represent disruption. The Arctic's silence is part of its structure, part of the equilibrium that sustained its hidden ecosystems for ages. When that quiet changes, everything else must adjust. Yet even as these disruptions spread, the Arctic continues to demonstrate resilience. In places where ice has receded, new forms of life appear. Algae grow along the undersides of thinner sheets, creating colour in a place that once reflected only white and blue. Birds nest on newly exposed cliffs. Fish migrate to new feeding grounds. Microbes colonize meltwater pools and frozen sediments simultaneously, bridging the boundary between past and present ecosystems. The transformation is not one-sided, it's a reorganization. The silence doesn't end, it evolves, filled with new kinds of life that adapt faster than we expect. The hidden world beneath the North Pole remains alive not despite change, but through it. Every discovery made in these regions reinforces a larger truth. Life's most powerful quality is its refusal to stop. No matter how extreme the environment, no matter how long the dormancy, no matter how deep the silence, life finds a way to persist. The Arctic, in all its frozen isolation, embodies that truth better than anywhere else. It demonstrates that survival is not about dominance or abundance. It's about balance and endurance. The systems that function beneath the ice operate on principles of efficiency and cooperation that contrast sharply with the way humans often view survival. They thrive because they waste nothing, disturb little, and adapt slowly but decisively. They remind us that existence does not require noise, speed, or visibility. It requires continuity. As the ice continues to change, that continuity takes on new meaning. The Arctic's hidden life may become more visible as layers melt, but visibility does not mean understanding. Much of what happens beneath the ice remains beyond our perception, unfolding at scales of time and chemistry that we can only infer. The patience required to comprehend it mirrors the patience required to coexist with the planet itself. Every new measurement, every core sample, every expedition reveals more complexity than simplicity. The deeper we look, the more connections we find between ancient cells and modern ecosystems, between chemical reactions and climate regulation, between silence and survival. The Arctic's quiet teaches us how to listen differently, not for sound, but for persistence. The realization that the Arctic is still alive, even in silence, carries implications beyond this region. It reshapes how we think about habitability across the universe. If life can exist here, under pressure, in cold without sunlight, it can exist elsewhere under similar extremes. The same principles that allow Arctic microbes to persist could apply to life beneath the icy crusts of other worlds. The Arctic becomes not just a region of Earth, but a model for the universe's hidden biology. What we find beneath its silence may guide how we search for life beyond our planet, and perhaps one day how we recognize it. And yet, for all its scientific significance, the Arctic's vitality is also a reminder of something more personal. The silence that fills its expanse mirrors the silence within us. The moments between thoughts, the pauses between breaths, the stillness that allows reflection. Just as the Arctic's quiet conceals motion, our own stillness conceals awareness. The ice beneath the North Pole and the mind that observes it are not so different. Both hold memory, both adapt through change, both remain alive even when they seem at rest. The connection between them is not mystical, it's biological. We are made of the same elements, governed by the same laws, participating in the same cycles. The Arctic's survival is our survival in slower form. As the world grows louder, the existence of a place defined by quiet persistence becomes even more valuable. The Arctic doesn't compete for attention, it endures. It doesn't seek recognition, it simply continues. Beneath its silence, life maintains its rhythm, indifferent to whether anyone is listening. That endurance carries a kind of wisdom, a reminder that existence doesn't require affirmation, only continuity. In a time when change feels relentless, the Arctic offers perspective. It shows that adaptation can be slow, that progress can be patient, that survival doesn't always announce itself. The hidden world beneath the ice doesn't need to declare its presence to be real. It simply is. The Arctic remains alive, not because of resistance, but because of balance. Every process within it, from the freezing of brine channels to the movement of deep-sea currents, exists in relation to everything else. That balance is fragile, but it is also persistent. Even if the ice recedes entirely, the cycles it sustained will continue in altered forms. The chemistry will persist, the life will adjust, and the silence will find new expressions. Nothing in nature is ever truly lost. It only changes state. The Arctic stillness is not the absence of life. It's the pause between transformations. If you were to stand there now, at the edge of the frozen sea, and listen closely, you might still hear that silence. It wouldn't be empty. It would be full of movement too slow to notice, of breathing too faint to hear, of time stretching across the distance between what was and what will be. The Arctic is alive beneath that quiet, carrying the memory of the world and the promise of its endurance. Even as its surface changes, even as the ice shifts and melts, the pulse beneath remains. It's not loud, it's not fast, but it's steady. Beneath the silence, everything continues. Beneath the silence, the world still lives.